Hi guys, welcome back to another quiet evening together. Tonight, let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and take a slow, serene journey into the shadows of the past, to a moment in history that left behind more questions than answers. We're going to explore the mystery surrounding the final days of Queen Elizabeth I, a monarch whose reign brought the golden age to England, but whose death came cloaked in silence and secrecy. This story will unfold gently over many parts. 24 in total. We'll walk through her life, her health, her relationships, her habits, fears, and her final hours, trying to untangle what may have truly caused her death. Was it old age, heartbreak, or something darker still? Let's begin. In the waning days of March 1603, the court at Richmond Palace was silent. The cold had begun to break, the thaw of spring hinting at renewal outside the thick stone walls, yet inside the air was still and heavy. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, was no longer speaking. She had not spoken in hours. She had not eaten in days. She had barely slept in weeks. And yet, no one dared to say the words that trembled beneath every breath, that the Queen was dying. It was not an ordinary death, and Elizabeth was not an ordinary woman. By the time the end approached, she was 70 years old, a remarkable age for the early 17th century. She had ruled for over 44 years, navigated wars, treason, threats of assassination, and political games of extraordinary complexity. Her intellect had been unmatched, her resolve unshakable. But in the final weeks of her life, something had broken, and no one could say exactly what it was. There are whispers in the corridors of time that she died of pneumonia, that she succumbed to blood poisoning from the lead in her beloved white makeup, that she simply starved herself to death, unable or unwilling to go on. Some say she was haunted. Some say she was poisoned. Some believe her death was written long before, not by doctors or poisoners, but by the weight of her secrets. The story begins not at her deathbed, but years before. To understand her end, we must understand her life. A life defined by power, loneliness, love unfulfilled, and a relentless pressure to remain more than human. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, had crafted her image carefully, a sovereign untouched by the ordinary frailties of womanhood. She wore masks upon masks, a queen in ivory and jewels, a goddess, a myth. Yet beneath the silks and portraits and ceremonial declarations, there was a woman of flesh and blood, a woman who had once been imprisoned in the Tower of London, fearing for her life under her sister's rule. A woman who had watched her mother beheaded when she was barely 3 years old. A woman who had survived political enemies, conspiracies, heartbreak and loss, over and over again. In the final year of her life, Elizabeth lost Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, the last man who had dared to capture her heart. He was a favourite of the court, handsome, daring, flawed. His execution for treason in 1601 devastated her. Though their relationship had been stormy, his death left a mark. It was not only personal, it was political. The people murmured. Her court trembled. Elizabeth seemed diminished. After Essex's death, those close to her noted a change. She became withdrawn. She spent more time in solitude. She sat in dark rooms and refused food for long stretches. Her strength began to falter. Her cheer faded. But still, no one dared question the Queen. Physicians came and went. Courtiers whispered behind heavy velvet curtains, and rumours flickered through London like candle flames. She had always been meticulous about her appearance. The chalky white face paint, called Venetian ceruse, was part of her legend. It gave her an unearthly pallor, almost divine. But it contained lead, and applied year after year, it may have slowly poisoned her. Lead poisoning could explain many of her symptoms: fatigue, memory loss, depression, tremors, confusion. But there were other signs too, hints that her decline was more than physical. One of the most haunting details from her final days is this: she would not go to bed. For nearly a week, Elizabeth stood or sat on cushions, wrapped in layers of robes and shawls, but refused to lie down. It was as if she knew that once she did, she would never rise again. Her attendants begged her. She only shook her head. "Must," she whispered once. "Must is not a word to use to princes." Even at the end, she clung to control. Perhaps she feared sleep. Perhaps she feared the visions waiting in the darkness, of Essex's head falling, of her mother's scream, of her own throne slipping from beneath her. Maybe she knew, deep down, that her time was over, and laying down would mean surrendering everything she had spent her life fighting to hold on to. As the days passed, her voice grew faint. She took no nourishment. She wept silently at times, though no one dared to ask why. Her ladies watched helplessly as the woman who had once commanded fleets and crushed rebellions now seemed lost in shadows. On March 23rd, she slipped into a deep, unbroken silence. That night, the Archbishop and her closest courtiers gathered. The chamber was lit with low candles flickering over tapestries and gilded edges of chairs. Outside, the Thames flowed cold and dark. Inside, the Queen was finally still. At dawn, she was gone. But even in death, Elizabeth left no clarity. No cause of death was officially recorded. No autopsy was performed. She left behind no children, no heir she had publicly named. Only riddles, and a realm that had to move forward, even as it mourned. And so the questions remain. What truly brought about the end of this extraordinary monarch? Was it the poison in her paint, the heartbreak in her soul, the loneliness of power? Or did she simply will herself out of this world, exhausted from a life spent defying it? We'll explore it all, slowly, carefully, as if we're walking through the halls of Richmond Palace ourselves, with only candlelight to guide us. In the next part, we'll go back to the beginning, to a young Elizabeth Tudor, a motherless child surrounded by danger, unknowingly preparing for a fate far greater and far heavier than anyone could imagine. The story of Elizabeth Tudor began in a palace touched by glory, but shrouded in silence. Born on the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace, she entered the world not to triumph, but to disappointment. For her father, King Henry VIII, had desperately wanted a son. Instead, his new queen, Anne Boleyn, had given him a daughter. The heralds still announced the birth with great ceremony, but the air around the court was strained, an uneasy balance between celebration and quiet dismay. Elizabeth's early days were not filled with the warmth one might imagine for a royal child. Her mother, ambitious and quick-witted, had risen from the lady-in-waiting to queen, a rapid ascent that had earned her both admiration and bitter enemies. The birth of a daughter did little to fortify Anne's position. The infant Elizabeth was soon left in a precarious situation, one that would only become more dangerous as the winds of her father's favour began to shift. By the time she was 2.5 years old, the world as she knew it would be shattered. In May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested, tried, and executed on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason. Whether the charges were true or merely convenient accusations is a question historians still debate. What mattered then was that Elizabeth's mother was gone, beheaded by the order of the very man who had once moved heaven and earth to marry her. Elizabeth, once heir to the English throne, was declared illegitimate. Her title of princess was stripped. She was no longer the daughter of a queen, but the bastard child of a disgraced woman. And yet, even as a toddler, she survived. Others might have faded into obscurity, but Elizabeth remained within the royal household, a silent observer to the brutality and theatre of power. She was sent to live away from court, mostly under the care of Lady Margaret Bryan and later Cat Ashley, who became a maternal figure to her. Her education began early. Even in her earliest years, those around her remarked upon her brilliance, her quick grasp of languages, her sharp wit, her hunger to learn. She devoured books, soaked up lessons in Latin, French, and philosophy, and showed an uncanny ability to read a room, to sense danger before it arrived. Perhaps it was this early exposure to instability that honed her survival instincts. She grew up watching the fates of others rise and fall with a glance, a whisper, a shift in the king's mood. Her half-sister Mary had been cast aside and forced to serve in Elizabeth's household after her own mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been displaced. The two sisters shared a bond forged in mutual humiliation, both daughters of discarded queens, both treated as pawns on the chessboard of their father's will. Elizabeth learned to remain silent when needed, to speak with precision, and to reveal only what she wished others to know. The court was a dangerous place, filled with shifting alliances, spies, and sudden executions. A misplaced word could mean ruin. She listened, she studied, she endured. When her father married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth was brought back into more regular contact with the court. Catherine took an interest in her stepdaughter, encouraging her education, surrounding her with poets and reformist thinkers. This period was, perhaps, one of the few bright chapters of her youth, filled with learning, music, poetry, and cautious hope. But it was not to last. After King Henry's death in 1547, the court once again became a labyrinth of intrigue. Elizabeth, then 13, was sent to live with Catherine Parr and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. What followed was a time of deep discomfort and strange, whispered rumours. Seymour, ambitious and charismatic, paid the young princess an inappropriate amount of attention. He visited her early in the mornings, tickled her, and once was said to have entered her chambers in his nightclothes. Catherine Parr reportedly tried to manage the situation, even joining in the teasing to diffuse it. But the matter grew darker. Eventually Elizabeth was sent away, likely for her own safety and reputation. When Catherine Parr died in childbirth in 1548, Seymour began making plans to marry Elizabeth, perhaps seeing her as a means to restore his influence. But the plot unravelled, and he was arrested. During the investigation, Elizabeth was questioned for days. At only 15, she showed extraordinary composure, refusing to incriminate herself, evading entrapment, and maintaining a calm demeanour that left her interrogators frustrated and uneasy. It was her first real test of survival, and she passed. As the reign of her half-brother Edward VI progressed, Elizabeth maintained a careful distance from the centre of power. Edward's court was dominated by Protestant reformers, and Elizabeth, well educated in both Catholic and Protestant doctrine, showed a tendency to lean toward the Reformed faith. Though she never declared herself too strongly, she watched, she waited. Then in 1553, Edward died young, and the realm plunged once more into chaos. There was an attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, a girl barely older than Elizabeth, manipulated by powerful families. The coup failed, and Mary, Elizabeth's half-sister, was crowned queen. The years that followed would haunt Elizabeth forever. Queen Mary was a devout Catholic, determined to restore the old faith. Her reign became known for the Marian persecutions, as hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake. Elizabeth, though cautious, became the natural rallying point for Protestant opposition. Mary knew this. She had Elizabeth arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where their mother and grandmother had once been held before their deaths. It is said that when Elizabeth arrived at the Tower, it was raining. She paused beneath the archway and declared that she was no traitor. Her composure never faltered, but inside, she must have been terrified. The Tower was a place of endings. She had seen too many people enter and never leave. But again, she survived. No evidence could be found against her. Eventually, she was released and placed under house arrest at Woodstock. She was 20 years old. These early years, filled with danger, abandonment, betrayal, and constant uncertainty, shaped her into the woman who would become queen. A woman who trusted few, spoke little, and understood the cost of every word she spoke. She had learned, painfully and thoroughly, that love could be fatal, that power was fragile, and that survival often meant being the last one standing in the silence after the storm. To understand Elizabeth's death is to first understand that from the moment she was born, death was always close. Her life was not a steady ascent to power. It was a series of escapes. From the scaffold, from the tower, from the grasp of men who saw her as a prize. Each escape left a mark, though she would never show it. The child who had watched her mother fall became the queen who would never let anyone close enough to watch her crumble. In the next part, we will step into the moment that changed her forever, when the crown was placed on her head, and she ceased to be Elizabeth the woman and became Elizabeth the queen. The morning was cold and clear on November 17, 1558, when word reached Elizabeth at Hatfield House. Her sister, Queen Mary, was dead. After years of watching, waiting, and carefully navigating the treacherous waters of court life, Elizabeth was now Queen of England. She is said to have fallen to her knees beneath an ancient oak tree, eyes lifted to the heavens, and whispered a verse from the Bible. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." The girl who had been branded illegitimate, imprisoned in the Tower, and watched nearly everyone she loved die under suspicious or tragic circumstances, that girl was gone. In her place stood a monarch, wrapped in the thorns of memory and the iron will of survival. Her coronation took place on the 15th of January 1559, And even then, the signs were clear. This would be no ordinary reign. London had never seen such fervour. Crowds flooded the streets. There were pageants, music, poetry, and symbols carefully chosen to depict Elizabeth as the hope of the nation, the light after the storm. One tableau even portrayed her as Deborah, the biblical prophetess and judge, a woman ruling in wisdom and strength. The ceremony was elaborate, tinged with symbolism and quiet political messaging. Elizabeth's path to the throne had been bathed in uncertainty, but she intended to take her place firmly. She chose her own coronation ring and insisted that it be placed on the fourth finger of her right hand, not the left, as was tradition. When asked why, she replied with a small cryptic smile. Perhaps it was simply comfort. Perhaps it was a signal that she would not be bound by expectation. She was 25 years old. Beautiful, poised and brilliant. Yet, even at the height of this triumph, Elizabeth knew that the crown was not simply an ornament, it was a burden. She had seen what it did to her father, to her siblings. Power did not protect, it exposed. From the very first days of her reign, the question that dominated every conversation, whispered or shouted, was the same. Who will she marry? Marriage, to the men of her council, was a matter of national security. England needed an heir. The Queen needed a husband. But Elizabeth did not see it that way. In private, she had confided to her closest adviser, William Cecil, that she would never marry. Not truly. She would speak of possible unions, even entertain suitors, but always with a distance, always with a mask. The first man to draw close was Robert Dudley. He was tall, dark and handsome, born of noble blood, charming, intelligent and above all familiar. Elizabeth had known him since childhood. They had been prisoners in the Tower at the same time, though in separate cells. Dudley had seen her at her most vulnerable. Now he saw her in glory, and she allowed him near. Too near, according to many. Dudley was given rooms close to hers. He rode beside her, whispered to her, made her laugh. Rumours began to spread, whispers that they were lovers, that he visited her bedchamber in secret, that she would marry him and make him king. But there was a problem. Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived in the countryside. Rarely seen, often ill, and conveniently far from court. Then in 1560, she was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. The scandal erupted like wildfire. Though the official verdict declared it an accident, the damage was done. Elizabeth could never marry Robert Dudley after that. Not without confirming every ugly suspicion the court and the people already held. Still, she did not cast him away. He remained a presence at her side, always just beyond reach. Their relationship was one of longing and restraint, full of unspoken things. It became a pattern in Elizabeth's life. She surrounded herself with men who adored her, Dudley, Cecil, Walsingham, Hatton, later Essex, but never allowed any of them to possess her fully. She was a queen before all else. Her reign demanded it. In her first decade as monarch, she faced rebellion, assassination plots, religious tension, and endless pressure from abroad. Europe watched her, hungry and skeptical. Spain, France spied, and Rome saw her as an upstart heretic, a bastard queen with no divine right. The Pope excommunicated her. Spanish ships threatened her shores. Inside England, Catholic nobles plotted against her, and yet she endured. Elizabeth's weapon was her image. She became an icon, slowly transforming herself into something untouchable. She chose not to age. Her gowns became more elaborate, her face more painted, her hair more adorned. She spoke in riddles, delivered speeches with theatrical brilliance, and turned herself into a living myth. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Astrea, the woman married only to her realm. But behind the mask, the pressure was immense. She rose early each day and spent hours preparing her appearance. Her cosmetics grew thicker with time. A layer of white lead paint to hide blemishes, rouge to add colour, and a wig to conceal thinning hair. As the years passed, the preparations became longer, more demanding. Mirrors were banned from certain rooms. Only a few attendants were permitted to see her unadorned. She feared illness, feared weakness, and most of all feared vulnerability. Every decision was a calculation, every word a performance. The burden of being not only queen, but symbol, saviour and myth weighed heavily on her. She began to write in riddles, to speak as though through fog, so no one could say for certain what she meant. Despite the trials, she achieved greatness. Under her reign, England flourished. The arts bloomed, the navy grew strong. Explorers like Francis Drake circled the globe, and Shakespeare began to shape the English language itself. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 secured her place in history, a moment of triumph that Elizabeth milked with theatrical genius. She dressed in white and silver armour and declared to her troops at Tilbury that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. The crowd roared. The legend deepened. But triumph came at a cost. With each year, the Queen withdrew further into performance. Her laughter became rarer. Her close friends died or fell from grace. She replaced them with younger courtiers who admired her but did not know her. The woman who had once devoured books and music now passed hours in silence, lost in thought. She kept the court moving, never staying too long in one place. Perhaps in fear that if she paused, something might catch up with her. Though she refused to marry, she adopted the language of love. She called her people her children, her counsellors her consorts, her realm her beloved. It was an elegant evasion, a way to be all things to all people without belonging to anyone. But in private, her solitude grew colder. She knew she could trust no one fully. Her body was not hers, not in the way others understood. It belonged to England, to the myth she had created. Any sign of illness, fatigue, or despair had to be hidden. Even as age crept in, she resisted. In portraits, she was still young, still radiant. In person, her courtiers averted their eyes from the tremors in her hands, the slow shuffle of her steps, the fading strength behind her words. By the time she reached 60, she was a legend still living, and it is a heavy thing to be a living legend. Every breath had to serve the myth. Every glance had to conceal the truth, but truth, like time, always waits. In the next part, we will turn our attention to the gradual unraveling, not of power, but of the woman beneath it. The mask begins to crack, and when it does, we will see not the Virgin Queen of golden portraits, but Elizabeth as she truly was, aging, tired, and desperately clinging to the silence she had mastered so well. The year was 1590, and the Queen was aging, not yet weak, not yet bowed, but no longer untouched by time. Elizabeth Tudor, now in her late 50s, stood before the mirror longer each morning. The preparation of her face, her hair, her gown, once ritual, now necessity. The weight of her appearance had grown with her years, for every wrinkle was a threat, every grey strand a whisper of mortality. The mask she had so carefully crafted could not slip. To show age was to show weakness, and weakness was a language that England's enemies spoke fluently. At court, the dance continued. Courtiers flattered, poets praised, and painters brushed away the decades. In the images sent abroad, to foreign courts and curious ambassadors, Elizabeth remained radiant, divine, unmarred by the passage of time. But behind the velvet curtains, things were beginning to shift. She had begun to lose people. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, had grown frail. They had worked together for over 30 years. He had been her compass, her shield, her steadying voice in chaos. His slow retreat from public life left a void. She filled it for a time with his son Robert Cecil, who was clever, loyal and sharp, but never quite the same. Walsingham, her spymaster, had died years before. Drake was gone. Leicester, her dear Robert Dudley, had been buried since 1588. One by one, the names that had stood beside her on the stage of history vanished into memory. She did not replace them. She could not. Loneliness crept in like fog across the Thames, silent, damp, persistent. The Queen, who had commanded fleets and outwitted kings, now spent hours sitting motionless. Her courtiers began to note her silences. Her attendants reported her appetite fading. The music at court grew quieter, the laughter more forced. There was, however, one new figure in her life, a spark in the gathering twilight. His name was Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was young, passionate, and brimming with ambition, and he was Dudley's stepson. Elizabeth had known him since he was a boy, but as he grew into manhood, he captivated her attention. His charm was reckless, his temper wild, and his vanity impossible to miss. But he brought something few others could offer her anymore, the illusion of youth. He flattered her, challenged her, even disobeyed her, and she forgave him more than she should have. He danced where others tiptoed. He made her laugh. And yet, beneath it all, he also tested her resolve. Essex wanted power, real power, and he did not know how to wait for it. As the 1590s wore on, Elizabeth's health became more fragile. Her teeth had rotted and she struggled to chew. Her gums were infected. The pain left her short-tempered and weary. Her hair, once red gold and radiant, was now sparse, replaced by elaborate wigs. Her eyes, once sharp, grew watery and her hearing began to fade. She wore gloves constantly to hide the swelling in her hands. Her feet ached from the weight of her own gowns. She endured it all in silence. No public admission was made. No physician dared speak frankly. The Queen was still the Queen, and the image, the myth, could not be tarnished. Only those closest to her saw the truth, and even they spoke of it in hushed tones. Elizabeth began to withdraw from courtly life. Where once she had relished dances, banquets and pageants, now she often remained in her chambers. She slept poorly, waking often in the night, dreams perhaps, or memories. She took long walks alone in her private gardens. Her ladies observed that sometimes she would speak under her breath, as if holding quiet conversations with people long gone. The late 1590s were a time of exhaustion, not just for the Queen, but for the country. War with Spain dragged on, finances were strained, famine struck in parts of the realm and plague crept through cities. The glory of earlier years seemed to wane, and still Elizabeth carried it all on her shoulders. Her relationship with Essex deteriorated. He wanted command, glory, prestige. She gave him chances. In 1599 she appointed him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, sending him to suppress the ongoing rebellion, a task that had broken many before him. Essex promised swift victory. Instead, he disobeyed orders, negotiated with the rebels, and then, in a shocking display of defiance, returned to court uninvited, bursting into her private chambers while she was unprepared, without her wig or makeup. She was furious, but more than that, she was humiliated. She could forgive many things, but to be seen that way, vulnerable, unmasked, was a betrayal. She banished him from court. The following year, Essex, desperate and spiralling, staged a pathetic coup attempt, hoping to rally the people of London to his side and force his way back into power. The city did not rise. His followers were arrested. He was imprisoned in the Tower, the same place his stepfather Dudley had once occupied, the same place Elizabeth herself had once waited for her fate. She signed his death warrant with trembling hands. On February 25, 1601, Robert Devereux was beheaded for treason. He was 34 years old. Something inside her cracked that day. She had executed friends before. She had ordered deaths. She had survived loss. But this was different. Essex had touched something human in her, a memory of youth, perhaps, or the illusion that she could still inspire, still be adored as a woman, not just a monarch. After his death, Elizabeth changed. She grew quieter, more remote. Her appetite waned further. She wept more often, sometimes in solitude, sometimes before her ladies. She stopped sleeping well, often standing for hours at night, wrapped in furs, gazing into empty fireplaces or pacing the long corridors of her palaces. Music no longer moved her. Poetry no longer stirred her. She kept the court in motion, always moving from one palace to another, as if she could outrun her own sorrow. But grief clings like a shadow. In public, she remained composed. In portraits, she still shone. But those who saw her up close began to worry. Her eyes were dimmer. Her hands trembled slightly. Her voice, once a clarion call, now softened to a whisper in certain hours. Her famous memory faltered. Her smile appeared less and less. Behind closed doors, she began to withdraw, not just from people, but from life itself. She refused to name a successor, refused to speak of death, refused even to rest. And yet the signs were all around her, not just in her body, but in her silence. The woman who had survived so much, who had defied expectations and outlived her enemies, now faced a foe she could not outwit: time. In the next chapter, we will step deeper into these final years, where Elizabeth's mind, once sharp and brilliant, began to wander, and the weight of memory pressed down with a force even a queen could no longer bear. By the turn of the century, the glow of Elizabeth's reign had begun to dim, not in triumphs or treaties, but in the quiet corners of her mind. The Queen, once hailed as the embodiment of divine rule and mortal majesty, now moved through her palaces like a ghost in her own legend. Her steps grew slower, her voice quieter, and yet the performance continued. In the light of day, she still dressed with care. Her wigs were powdered, her ruffs stiff with starch, her face painted to a gleaming white mask that cracked at the edges if one looked too closely. She smiled when she must, she spoke when it was required, but the spark had dulled. Elizabeth Tudor was no longer living. She was enduring. After the execution of the Earl of Essex, a heaviness took root inside her. It was more than sorrow. It was something quieter, heavier, a fatigue that had little to do with age and everything to do with spirit. She had ruled for over 4 decades. She had buried almost everyone who had once known her as a young woman. She was surrounded by courtiers who adored her title, but few who knew her heart. More and more, she sought solitude. In the great halls where once music and laughter danced until dawn, silence now reigned. Her presence, once commanding, was now often requested, but rarely sustained. She would disappear into her chambers for long hours, emerging only when absolutely necessary. She grew restless. She disliked sitting, yet had no strength to walk far. Her attendants would find her standing motionless, staring out the tall, frost-lined windows, her hands tightly clasped as if holding something invisible together. At night, she no longer slept easily. She would remain upright in her chair or on her cushions, sometimes through the darkest hours of the morning. Lying down, she believed, would be an invitation to death, and Elizabeth had long resisted all invitations she did not personally extend. Her ladies-in-waiting, loyal and worried, pleaded with her to rest, to eat, to let physicians attend to her. She refused. There is a loneliness that cannot be touched by presence, a quiet that no voice can fill. Elizabeth, who had once held all of Europe at attention, now seemed to listen only to the voices within. Whispers from the past, perhaps, or echoes of regrets too deeply buried to name. One of the Queen's last great affections, the Countess of Nottingham, lay dying in 1603. It is said that before her death, the Countess confessed something to Elizabeth, something that shook the Queen deeply. According to one account, the Countess had, years earlier, kept a ring from reaching Elizabeth, a final plea for mercy from the Earl of Essex before his execution. Whether the story is true or not is uncertain, but the result was clear. Elizabeth wept with a fury few had seen in years. She shouted, "May God forgive you, but I never can." Then she turned away, and not long after, she began to slip. By February of 1603, her energy was nearly gone. Her appetite had vanished. Her limbs ached. Her skin, once shielded beneath layers of lead-based makeup, had grown grey and papery. The years of cosmetic use, the Venetian ceruse with its poisonous lead, may have slowly poisoned her blood, affecting her organs, her memory, her very balance. Her gums had receded, her teeth were blackened or missing, her hair was little more than wisps, and yet she would not stop. She still rose, still dressed, still performed. She still refused to name a successor, though all eyes turned to James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth had spent a lifetime guarding her power, and now, as the end loomed, she would not give it away lightly. Her court grew quiet, anxious. Whispers floated through corridors. Was she ill? Would she recover? Was this the end? And always, would she name the next monarch before death closed her lips forever? In March, she was moved to Richmond Palace, just outside London. The air was clearer there, and it was hoped the change might revive her. But instead, she began to drift further away. She spoke less and less. Sometimes she murmured to herself. Sometimes she wept and would not say why. She refused her bed. She sat for hours on cushions laid across the floor, wrapped in robes, her crown and sceptre far from her reach. Courtiers gathered, waiting for word, for a glance, for a decision. She gave none. A few physicians came and went, but she would not let them examine her. She insisted there was nothing wrong. She dismissed their questions. When one dared to ask if she would rest, she replied only, "Little man, the word must is not to be used to princes." The chill of spring lingered in the halls of Richmond. Fires were lit, but the Queen refused too much warmth. Her body, once so tightly controlled, now betrayed her with trembling and stiffness. She would not eat. She barely drank. She would not lie down. Her ladies watched helplessly. Some said she feared sleep. Others said she feared waking to find herself no longer queen. But more likely, far more heartbreakingly, Elizabeth knew that if she lay down, she would not rise again. On the 23rd of March, her silence deepened. She no longer responded. She no longer opened her eyes. The courtiers, finally recognizing what she had known for weeks, called for the Archbishop of Canterbury. He prayed beside her, as did her attendants. In the dim candlelight of the chamber, her frail body seemed already halfway vanished. The woman who had once danced through banquets, who had commanded battles and outwitted kings, who had stared down death more times than any monarch in living memory, now slipped quietly from life. On the morning of March 24th, 1603, Queen Elizabeth first died. She left behind no children, no husband, no written will, no final declaration, only a legend. And yet, even in death, the questions remained. What had truly killed her? Was it age? Was it the accumulated poisons of her makeup and medicines? Was it grief, guilt, or exhaustion? Or was it something more elusive? Something no physician could diagnose, and no historian could ever truly explain. A soul too weary to keep performing. A heart too full to keep beating. A queen who had ruled not only a nation but herself with an iron will, finally relinquishing her grip. In the next part, we will return to the whispers, the theories that swirled after her death, and begin to peel back the layers of mystery that enshroud the final cause of the Queen's passing. There is more to uncover, much more. When Elizabeth I passed into stillness at Richmond Palace, the realm did not yet understand what it had lost. The Queen's body was lifeless, but her myth, like a candle in a closed room, burned on. And in that flickering light, questions began to grow, subtle at first, then louder, until they wound their way through chambers, through taverns, through the hearts of historians even now. What truly caused the death of Elizabeth Tudor? There was no official proclamation, no precise diagnosis. The physicians gave vague accounts: old age, melancholy, physical decline. But those who had served her knew that death had not taken her suddenly. It had stalked her, crept around her edges for years, waiting for the moment when she could no longer look away. One theory stood tall among the whispers, that it was grief that undid her. Not the theatrical grief one wears in public, but a slower, more corrosive thing. A kind of sorrow that works its way through the bones, that leaves the heart thin and stretched. The loss of Robert Devereux had left its mark. Her anger at his betrayal had scorched her, but his execution had hollowed her. She had loved him, not as a girl loves a suitor, nor as a woman loves a husband. It was more complicated, more dangerous. The love of a sovereign for the last echo of her own youth, for the spark of admiration she could still command. In Essex, she saw a version of herself still capable of being desired, still able to ignite fire in others. And when she signed his death warrant, she buried more than a man. She buried the illusion. It is said that after Essex's execution, she aged rapidly. Her vibrancy faded. She grew suspicious of even her most loyal counsellors. And though she continued to speak publicly, her private words became riddles or silence. She no longer seemed to be speaking to the world around her, but to something within. Grief, some have said, changes the shape of a person's soul. In Elizabeth, it changed her will to live. But grief was not the only shadow clinging to her. Another theory, one that continues to raise eyebrows among scholars and physicians alike, is that of blood poisoning, slow and deadly, laced into her very skin. For decades, Elizabeth had painted her face with Venetian ceruse, a white paste made of vinegar and lead. It was fashionable. It was the symbol of her purity, her distance from the ordinary. To be pale was to be noble, untouched by labour or sun. And Elizabeth embraced this ideal fully. The paint masked her blemishes, her aging skin, and the scarring left by a bout of smallpox in 1562. After that illness, which nearly killed her, she never again allowed herself to be seen without her makeup. Not by servants, not by lovers. It was not vanity, but preservation. Her image was her armour, but the cost was steep. Venetian ceruse was lethal in long exposure. It could damage the kidneys, corrode the nervous system, and lead to tremors, confusion, hair loss, and a gradual decay of physical and mental faculties. And Elizabeth had used it religiously, daily, for more than 40 years. Her symptoms in later life align eerily with chronic lead poisoning. Fatigue, depression, trembling hands, weakened vision, failing memory. The swelling in her limbs, the discoloration of her gums, the brittleness of her hair. These were not simply the signs of aging, some argue, but the evidence of a body slowly poisoned by the very substance that helped sustain her illusion of timeless beauty. She had, perhaps unknowingly, sacrificed her health to remain ageless. She became a prisoner of her own appearance, and while the lead served her myth, it betrayed her body. There were whispers, too, of mercury, a substance used in early skin treatments and medicine. Mercury was a common ingredient in elixirs and tonics used to treat ailments ranging from syphilis to melancholia. But like lead, it was poison. It could damage the brain, lead to paranoia, insomnia, hallucinations. And Elizabeth, ever fearful of illness, was known to experiment with concoctions meant to preserve her youth and strength. Could it have been a toxic combination? A brew of unregulated potions and paints that eroded her mind while preserving her mask? Others point to the simplest answer, pneumonia. It was March. The air still damp and cold. The Queen had refused the fire in her room. She would not lie down. She had eaten almost nothing for days, consumed little water, and barely moved. Her body, already frail, could not fight a fever or infection. The idea that her lungs may have filled, that fluid choked her final breaths, seems likely. But still, there are questions. No physician wrote of her having a persistent cough. No report exists of fever or difficulty breathing. Only silence, emptiness, a refusal to speak, a refusal to rest. That silence is at the heart of every theory. For in the end, Elizabeth did not die with a cry or collapse. She did not scream in pain or writhe in fever. She sat, then lay, then faded, as if she had quietly stepped out of her own myth and into a place where no one could follow. There is a final theory, the most difficult to name, that she willed herself to die. Elizabeth had always been a woman of choice. She chose her image, her suitors, her causes, her crown. Even as age overtook her, she clung to control. But in those final weeks, when everything, even her ability to stand, was failing her, it may be that she made her last and most personal decision. She had watched others die on terms not their own. Her mother on the scaffold. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, in an execution she herself had ordered. Her father, bloated and ulcered. Her sister raving and childless. Her favourites, Dudley, Essex, condemned by fate or by her hand. Perhaps she saw what waited beyond her last pageant. A future where she was no longer queen, no longer adored, no longer remembered in the way she had crafted. She had no heir, she had no husband, she had no child to sing her memory. And so she chose to leave while she still wore the crown. No one could prove it. No physician could measure a will so strong it stops the heart. But those who stood beside her in those final days, they saw something rare. A sovereign who for the first time did not resist. She refused food, she refused comfort, she refused to lie down. But when the time came, she did not cling to the world. She simply let go. And in doing so, Elizabeth Tudor, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor monarch, became eternal. In the next part, we will move beyond the cause and into the aftermath. How did England react to the death of its queen? What happened in the hours and days that followed? And how did her passing change the course of a kingdom teetering between past and future? At Richmond Palace, on that early morning of March 24th, 1603, a strange and heavy stillness settled over the corridors. The Queen had died in the small hours, her ladies-in-waiting weeping quietly at her side, their heads bowed. No thunder cracked across the sky, no bells rang. Outside, the Thames continued its slow passage, unconcerned with the passage of monarchs. But within the palace, the world had changed. Elizabeth was gone. For a moment, brief but sharp, there was uncertainty. The Queen had died without naming her successor aloud. Though most believed she intended for James VI of Scotland to inherit the crown, she had never publicly declared it. She had danced around the question for years, always refusing to relinquish even the idea of the throne, afraid perhaps that in naming another she would hasten her own end. And yet, in her final hours, it is said she nodded, weakly, subtly, when asked if James should be her heir. A single movement, one final act of sovereignty from a woman whose voice had once ruled armies. That nod would carry the weight of an entire kingdom. Sir Robert Cecil, the son of Elizabeth's most trusted adviser, acted swiftly. The court had to be secured, the country calmed, the transition quiet. England had suffered too many turbulent changes of power. They could not afford chaos. They could not afford war. So Cecil sent word north, urgent, discreet, unyielding. To the most high and mighty Prince James, King of Scotland, Your Majesty's most humble subjects of your realm of England, do with one united voice and full consent of heart and tongue proclaim that the late Queen Elizabeth died this morning, and that your majesty is her lawful successor by right and title of inheritance." The message moved faster than any army. James, in Scotland, received it with measured joy. He had waited for this moment for years. As the son of Mary, Queen of Scots and great-grandson of Henry VII, his claim was strong. Elizabeth had watched him grow from a distance, wary but calculating, keeping the Scottish king both close and far. Now the child of her cousin, whom she had ordered executed, would take her crown. But before the new reign could begin, Elizabeth's passing had to be made known, and the ritual of mourning, the sacred performance of royal death, had to unfold with exacting care. Word was sent to St. Paul's Cathedral. The great bell tolled solemnly, echoing across the city. In London's alleys and marketplaces, the news spread quickly. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the only monarch many had ever known, was dead. The people wept openly. Some prayed, some stood in stunned silence. In taverns and churches alike, her name was whispered with reverence, with fear, with awe. She had reigned for 44 years. An entire generation had known no other ruler. Her image had been stamped on coins, on banners, on the minds of her people. To them she was not just a queen, she was England itself. In the coming days, black banners were hung across palaces and churches. Courtiers changed into mourning garb. Bishops prepared sermons. But even as the symbols of loss settled over the land, the machinery of state had to continue. Robert Cecil oversaw the arrangements, quiet and tireless. The body of the Queen, delicate and pale beneath her ceremonial wrappings, was embalmed and placed in a lead-lined coffin. She was then taken to Whitehall Palace, where she would lie in state, a ghost among her court, attended by flickering candles and silent guards. And for days, no one entered the room without bowing. Her coffin, draped in cloth of gold, rested beneath a canopy. Her likeness, painted onto a wooden effigy clad in royal robes and a golden crown, sat atop it. Even in death, Elizabeth had to appear eternal. The people came in droves, noble and commoner alike. They filed past her resting place, some in tears, some with heads low, some merely gazing in stunned silence. For all her mystique, Elizabeth had been fiercely loved by many. Others had feared her, some had hated her, but none could deny the scope of her presence. And now that presence was gone. In early April, plans for her funeral were set in motion, an event of unparalleled solemnity. No expense was spared, no detail overlooked. She would be buried in Westminster Abbey among the kings and queens of old. The chosen date, April 28th. On the morning of the funeral, the city stood still. The cortege began at Whitehall, stretching longer than any in living memory. Nobles on horseback, bishops in robes, officials carrying banners of her lineage. 1,000 mourners marched behind the coffin, which was borne on a grand hearse drawn by 4 horses draped in black velvet. Atop the coffin sat the effigy, serene, distant, majestic, her sceptre and orb in hand, her head crowned with gold. The people along the streets watched in reverence. Some wept, some knelt. A hush followed the procession like a shadow. The bells of Westminster tolled slow and deep as the coffin entered the abbey. Inside, the greatest minds and voices of the age gathered to pay tribute. Prayers were read, psalms sung. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered the funeral oration, his voice trembling as he spoke of her virtues, her sacrifices, her reign. Elizabeth was lowered into the vault beneath the abbey, beside her half-sister Mary, the woman who had once imprisoned her. 2 queens, so different in life, united in death beneath the same stone. The inscription that marked her tomb was simple but powerful. Consorts both in throne and grave, here lie 2 royal sisters, Elizabeth and Mary. And so the Elizabethan age ended, not with war or rebellion, but with silence, ceremony, and a kingdom holding its breath. But even as James VI rode south to take the English throne as James I, the shadow of Elizabeth lingered. Her portraits still hung in great halls. Her speeches still echoed in the minds of those who had heard them. Her choices, her refusals, her triumphs, her losses still shaped the path ahead. She had ruled alone. She had died alone. And yet, she had left behind a legacy woven into the very bones of her nation. In the next part, we will follow that legacy, how Elizabeth's myth was shaped after her death, how her image was polished and preserved, and how, in preserving it, we may have lost pieces of the woman behind the crown. After her death, Elizabeth first began a second life, not in body, but in story. Even as her flesh was laid to rest beneath the cold stone of Westminster, her legend began to rise. The woman who had lived surrounded by illusion, who had crafted herself into a symbol larger than any mortal frame, was now being written into history. Shaped, reshaped, polished, sanctified. She had always worn a mask, but now that mask became permanent. In the immediate days after her burial, England entered a peculiar phase of mourning. Not merely grief for a monarch, but the careful construction of a memory. And at the heart of that construction was a delicate balancing act. Elizabeth had been powerful, clever, imperious. She had also been vengeful, proud, and occasionally cruel. But in death, the sharp edges began to soften. Her flaws began to fade, and in their place grew a myth, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of a nation. It was a myth she herself had seeded. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had wielded symbolism like a sword. She dressed in allegory, she spoke in verse, she controlled her image with a ruthless precision that modern rulers would envy. Her portraits were not reflections, but declarations. In them she was not aging, she was not tired, she was not alone. She was radiant, armoured in pearls, crowned by light. The rainbow portrait, painted near the end of her life, is perhaps the most surreal. Elizabeth stands adorned in a gown embroidered with eyes and ears, symbols of omnipresence. In one hand she holds a rainbow, a sign of divine favour, while her dress swirls in unnatural perfection. Her face is youthful, her hair a golden halo. She is not the frail, silent woman who refused to lie down at Richmond. She is the eternal queen, untouched by time. This was the version of Elizabeth that England clung to. And it was not just artists who helped build the myth. It was poets, playwrights, and scholars. William Camden, one of the earliest historians of her reign, wrote Annales, a glowing chronicle of Elizabeth's rule. He was meticulous, loyal, and subtle in his omissions. He downplayed the failures. He emphasized the triumphs. The Spanish Armada loomed large. The executions of Mary, Queen of Scots and Essex, were wrapped in necessity and solemn duty. The questions about her health, her makeup, her temper, all tucked gently out of sight. Others followed suit. The Elizabeth that emerged in the public mind in the years following her death was no longer entirely human. She was a goddess, a virgin, a warrior queen, a benevolent mother, a Protestant saviour. The Virgin Mary and Deborah of the Old Testament blended into one. But myths demand consistency. They resist contradiction. And so the inconvenient pieces of Elizabeth's story began to vanish. Her loneliness was reframed as strength. Her refusal to marry became a divine choice, not a wound. Her sorrow was airbrushed into stoicism. Even her age, which she had fought so bitterly, was turned into wisdom, never decay. As James first took the throne, he walked a narrow path. He owed his crown to Elizabeth, yet he needed to assert his own legitimacy. And so her memory became a ceremonial relic, honoured in words but distant in practice. Her image was kept in palaces and pageants, but her policies were often reversed. The closeness she had once cultivated with her people was replaced by James's preference for closed rooms and favoured Scotsmen. Yet the people, especially the English people, remembered her. They spoke of the good Queen Bess with fondness and yearning. Compared to the uncertainty of this new reign, Elizabeth's memory shimmered with stability. Her flaws, so evident in life, now seemed like the eccentricities of a glorious age. Shakespeare, who had written under her patronage, never penned a direct play about Elizabeth, but her spirit lingers in his heroines, in Portia's intelligence, in Cleopatra's majesty, in the indomitable will of Lady Macbeth. He understood that to write Elizabeth was to write myth, not woman. Over the decades, her image only grew. By the 18th century, she was portrayed as the shining star of England's Protestant destiny. Historians praised her prudence, her eloquence, her chastity. The Victorians, in particular, were enchanted. They imagined her as the embodiment of moral rectitude and national greatness. School children memorized her speeches. Her defeat of the Armada was cast in epic terms, as though she alone had turned back the tide. And yet, as her myth swelled, the woman beneath it disappeared. Few spoke of the late-night pacing, the whispered fears, the desperate clinging to life in her final days. Few acknowledged the anger she had carried, the jealousy, the bitter loneliness. No one discussed her blackened teeth, her rotting gums, the trembling hands hidden beneath jewelled gloves. No one dared question the crown she wore long after it had begun to weigh her down. The truth became ghostly. but still it lingers, in fragments, in letters, in eyewitness accounts, in overlooked details buried in dusty manuscripts. Somewhere between the image and the reality lies Elizabeth's true legacy, not merely as a ruler of men, but as a woman who bore the unbearable weight of being an idea. To be remembered as a myth is a peculiar kind of immortality. It preserves, but it also isolates. The real woman, the one who wept for Essex, who feared death, who clung to the dignity of performance until her last breath, remains locked behind the marble of her own legend. And yet, if one listens closely, one can still hear her. In the hush between pages, in the silence of Richmond's empty rooms, in the careful steps of those who attend to her tomb in Westminster Abbey. Her story may have been edited, but her presence has never truly left. In the next part, we will slip away from court and candlelight to examine the physical remains of her reign, the objects, letters, and rooms that still carry the imprint of her life. Through these we may glimpse the woman who lived within the myth and the traces she left behind. Far beyond the pages of history books and the lavish brushstrokes of portraiture, traces of Elizabeth I remain, not only in memory or myth, but in tangible things. Objects, rooms, scraps of parchment, gowns faded by time, ink blotted with thought. Through these, the silence of her final days is broken, and the breath of the woman beneath the crown may still be felt. Let us wander quietly now through the artifacts of a queen's life. Not the grand declarations or public victories, but the intimate items she touched, wore, held close. These remnants, faint but enduring, speak with a voice more delicate than parchment, and yet more honest than any chronicle. At the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, behind thick glass, rests a simple yet remarkable object, a pair of silk stockings believed to have belonged to the Queen. They are soft, finely knit, the colour faded with centuries, the heel slightly worn. They do not declare victory or command reverence, but in their fibres is the memory of motion, of Elizabeth walking briskly down the stone corridors of Greenwich, or pacing restlessly in her privy chambers at Whitehall. Nearby, other garments have survived, a white satin bodice, stiff with embroidery, fragile with age. Her gowns were not merely fashion, they were armour, each one layered in symbolism, pearls for purity, eyes and ears for omniscience, serpents for wisdom. The fabrics were heavy, the collars high, they concealed and revealed in equal measure. Every appearance was a performance, every ensemble an extension of her will. Yet within the stitching, within the hidden seams, were pins and stays that chafed. The weight was not only metaphorical. Her clothing left bruises, her shoes wore grooves into her feet, her corsets compressed her lungs, and still she endured it all, because to let her body falter in public was unthinkable. Then there are her letters, some written in a neat, slanted script, others in a hurried hand full of crossings out and margin notes. One in particular, addressed to Mary, Queen of Scots, trembles with tension. Elizabeth's words are elegant, but beneath the formality is a terrible strain, the agony of judging a cousin, a queen, a prisoner. "I am not the judge of princes," she once wrote, "but I am forced to wear that mask." That mask. Always the mask. Her correspondence with Robert Dudley offers glimpses of a softer Elizabeth. Affectionate, coy, occasionally wounded. She called him Sweet Robin, and her words, though guarded, betray a longing that never fully settled. In one letter she scolds him for being distant. In another, she signs off as yours as long as life endures. For a woman known to the world as untouchable, these letters glow with human warmth. And there are the mirrors, or rather the curious absence of them. In her later years, Elizabeth famously avoided reflections. It is said she banished all mirrors from her chambers. Whether myth or truth, it reveals something tender. The queen who ruled through spectacle may not have wanted to face the unvarnished truth of age, the decay of flesh, the ghost behind the powder. Yet one mirror does survive, a small handheld looking glass, ornately carved, the silver blackened. Whether it was truly hers or attributed later is debated. Still, it's tempting to imagine her holding it once, her gloved fingers tracing the edge, her eyes searching the glass not for beauty, but for control. In the Tower of London, her writing desk remains, a modest structure, unassuming, carved of oak. Here, Elizabeth may have drafted speeches, signed death warrants, composed verses. The grooves worn into the wood by her quill are faint, but still visible. They speak of sleepless nights, of decisions that shook the world. And there is the ring, perhaps the most personal relic of all. Elizabeth wore a ring with a hidden compartment, within which were two portraits, one of herself and one of her mother, Anne Boleyn. It was delicate, secret, worn on her hand for years. No one could see its contents unless she allowed it. To the world it was jewellery. To her it was memory, painful, cherished, unresolved. It is hard not to imagine her touching it in quiet moments, perhaps after dismissing her ladies, perhaps on those long nights at Richmond when the fire dimmed and the silence deepened. The daughter of a beheaded queen, holding her mother's face close to her pulse. The ring was only removed after her death. And then there are the rooms. Some still stand, though altered by time. Her bedchamber at Hampton Court, vast, echoing, once warmed by tapestries and flickering candles, now holds only the ghosts of whispers. The privy chamber at Whitehall is long gone. Yet records show it was lined with windows, flooded with light. Here she walked alone. Here she practiced speeches before delivering them to Parliament. Here she may have wept, unseen. Each of these spaces bore witness to her transformation, from flesh to myth, from girl to sovereign, from Elizabeth to Gloriana. Their walls absorbed her secrets. Their thresholds marked the points where power began and ended. Even the royal gardens, her favourite retreat, hold her imprint. She favoured sweet-smelling herbs, lavender, rosemary, marjoram. She walked among them often, trailing her fingers over leaves, speaking softly to her attendants, or saying nothing at all. She once wrote that the scent of rosemary sharpened the memory. Perhaps she hoped it would sharpen hers. These remnants, these objects, letters, garments, rooms, are not mere relics of a vanished queen. They are fragments of a woman navigating the unbearable tension between public adoration and private silence. They reveal more than any speech or pageant the weight she carried. A sceptre looks light when held in a portrait, but its burden lies in the hand unseen, the one trembling beneath the velvet glove, the one signing away lives, the one that reached each night for a ring containing a mother's face. In the next part, we will return to the public stage, to explore how Elizabeth used language, performance and spectacle to craft her power. We will walk through her speeches, her pageants, her theatre of state, and see how words became her strongest weapon, and perhaps her deepest shield. Elizabeth I ruled with words, not merely laws or proclamations, though she penned many, but with language sharpened like steel, burnished with poetry, veiled in ambiguity. In a world where armies could be overthrown and treaties undone, her true dominion lay in her voice. She understood more than any ruler of her time the alchemy of speech, how sound could become power, how cadence could shape belief, and how silence could be weaponized. She had no husband, no heir, no great battlefield conquest to immortalize her. But she had words, and with them she built a reign that endured for nearly half a century. From the earliest days of her rule, Elizabeth mastered the art of public performance. She knew that the court, the realm, the ambassadors from rival kingdoms, all of them watched, listened, interpreted. Her speeches, her gestures, her pauses, all carefully measured. But her words were not stiff recitations. They were performances, carefully rehearsed, intimately crafted, and often deeply felt. Take, for instance, the speech she delivered at Tilbury in August 1588, as the Spanish Armada approached English shores. The air was thick with fear. The Catholic superpower of Spain, with its vast fleet, had set its sights on England. Panic surged through the realm. Elizabeth rode out to the troops gathered at Tilbury, clad not in courtly robes but in a silver breastplate over a white velvet gown. And she spoke, "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The soldiers cheered. Morale surged. The Queen, pale, 55, unmarried and vulnerable, had made herself the symbol of resistance, not through bloodshed, through language. That line has echoed through the centuries. But the full speech, when read slowly, carries even more weight. She offered herself to them, body and soul, and in doing so made it impossible to see her as merely a woman. She became England itself. But Elizabeth's rhetorical mastery was not reserved for battlefields. It was woven into every layer of her reign. She addressed Parliament with both reverence and command. When pressed repeatedly about her refusal to marry, she answered not with irritation, but with crafted patience. I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England. She turned their expectations into her virtue, transformed what others called a deficiency into the very foundation of her image. She was the virgin queen not because she had no suitors, she had dozens, both domestic and foreign, but because she made chastity a tool of sovereignty. Her coronation speech in 1559 was simple and careful. She called herself a mere woman, a servant of God, and promised to consult her council before making decisions. But woven into the humility was a quiet warning that though she was young and female, she would rule with conviction. And she did. Even her responses to foreign powers bore the mark of her craft. When the French ambassador pressured her about her marriage plans, she deflected with elegance. "You may assure your master that I shall never be married with so little deliberation as he seems to look for." She said everything and nothing. She made promises that bent in the wind. She kept options open, alliances dangling, enemies guessing. Words, after all, cost nothing, but could buy time, peace, and power. Privately, her letters were full of veiled meanings. Her choice of phrasing often revealed more than she let on. In correspondence with Mary, Queen of Scots, she expressed concern, disdain, and veiled threat, all in the same paragraph. Her syntax was formal, but her tone often icy. She used courtesy as a blade, but it was not always defence. Elizabeth also wielded language to inspire, to comfort, to endear. She wrote poetry, spare, elegant verses rarely shared beyond her circle. One fragment, written in her own hand, reads, "I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I love and yet am forced to seem to hate." Here was the mask slipping, even if briefly. The Queen's voice not as ruler, but as a woman caught in the web of her own performance. She delivered speeches to her ladies, her nobles, her people. In each setting, she tailored her message. In council chambers, she was commanding. In religious services, humble. In public appearances, regal. She spoke in allegories, in metaphors, in measured tones that left room for interpretation. She understood the danger of clarity. She knew the strength of mystery. But not all her speeches were crafted solely by her hand. She had help, particularly from William Cecil and later his son, Robert. Her words were often drafted, reviewed, refined. Yet the voice was unmistakably hers. She made edits in her own hand. She added flourishes. She changed endings. She chose her tone. She once famously dismissed a proposed draft by her secretary with the simple margin note, "Too wordy, I do not mean to lecture them." She knew her audience, and perhaps most remarkable of all, she understood silence. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587, Elizabeth said nothing publicly for days. Her silence was interpreted in every direction. Some saw it as grief, others as guilt, some as political strategy, but it was deliberate. When Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, returned from Ireland in disgrace and burst into her chambers unannounced, she did not scream or punish him immediately. She went silent. The weight of that silence was heavier than any rebuke. To be silent in a world where words ruled was the ultimate power. Even her final days were defined by silence. As she lay on her cushions, refusing food, refusing sleep, refusing to speak, she enacted her last performance. She said nothing of death, nothing of succession, nothing of farewell. She let others interpret her stillness, and so they did. Words had been her armor, her mirror, her sword, and when the time came to relinquish it all, she used no words at all. In the next part, we will turn to the circle that surrounded Elizabeth in her final years, the advisors, companions, and shadows who watched her decline and carried her secrets. Through them we may see the Queen not as sovereign, but as a woman nearing the end, and what it meant to serve a legend unravelling before their eyes. In the final stretch of Elizabeth's long reign, her court became a strange garden, a place where old loyalty, quiet dread, and soft deceit bloomed together. Those who surrounded her in those last years were not merely attendants or counsellors. They were caretakers of a myth, guardians of appearances, and silent witnesses to the slow, painful dimming of a once blazing star. Many of the faces that had shared the triumphs of her youth, Cecil, Walsingham, Leicester, were gone. In their place stood younger men, born after her coronation, men who knew the Queen not as the bold, sharp figure of the 1560s, but as the pale, painted woman of the late 1590s. They respected her, they feared her, but few of them truly knew her. Only a small inner circle remained, a handful of women, a few aging councillors, and those who had proven themselves indispensable. Chief among them was Robert Cecil, son of William, her long-trusted adviser. Short in stature, riddled with physical ailments, and nearly invisible to the foreign ambassadors who underestimated him, Robert Cecil possessed one of the keenest political minds of the age. To Elizabeth he was both comfort and complication. She had known him since he was a boy. She had trusted his father with her life. Robert inherited that trust, carefully, deliberately, but not without suspicion. Elizabeth never gave her confidence freely, not even to those she depended on most. Cecil had to earn it daily. In her final years, it was Cecil who became her architect of continuity. He navigated the increasingly delicate politics of succession, holding secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland, all while carefully hiding those threads from the Queen herself. For Elizabeth refused to name a successor. To do so, in her mind, was to invite death. And Cecil knew she could not bear to feel death breathing down her neck. He moved quietly, strategically. His loyalty was complex. To her, yes, but also to England, to stability, to the future that loomed just beyond her final breath. He was perhaps the only man in her household who was preparing for a world without her, even as she refused to imagine one. Beside Cecil stood her women. Catherine Howard, the Countess of Nottingham, had been a close companion for decades. She was the niece of Anne Boleyn, and therefore kin in blood, though that closeness was rarely spoken aloud. Catherine served not only as a lady of the bedchamber, but as a quiet, emotional anchor, one of the few who could calm Elizabeth when grief or rage broke through the carefully painted surface. It was said that when the Countess lay dying, she sent for Elizabeth, desperate to confess something. Some whispered it was about a ring, perhaps the one that Robert Devereux had tried to send before his execution, a plea for mercy never received. Catherine had supposedly kept it from the Queen. If the story is true, then her deathbed confession struck Elizabeth like a blade. Witnesses claim she flew into a fury. "May God forgive you," she reportedly cried, "but I never can." Whether it was the truth, or only courtly gossip woven into legend, one thing is certain. After Catherine's death, Elizabeth spiraled deeper into melancholy. She withdrew, she wept, she grew silent. Her remaining attendants watched helplessly. Lady Scrope, Lady Warwick, Lady Stafford, they bore witness to the Queen's decline not as subjects, but as silent mourners in waiting. They helped her dress, gently covered the tremors in her hands, brushed her thinning hair, applied the thick white paint to her face. They pretended not to see when she drifted into reverie, speaking to people long dead. They smiled when she asked for music, and nodded solemnly when she changed her mind before the lute was strung. And then there was Blanche Parry. Blanche had served Elizabeth since the days of princesshood, a woman of fierce discretion and unshakable devotion. She had once been a nurse, then a gentlewoman, then keeper of the Queen's books and jewels. Her service spanned more than 50 years. By the final decade, she had grown too old to serve in person, but letters and visits continued. Blanche, like the Queen, had outlived nearly all her peers. In Blanche, Elizabeth saw a reflection of her own endurance, a woman who had never married, who had devoted her life entirely to service, who asked for nothing. Their connection ran deeper than protocol. They were kindred. And though Blanche died before the Queen, her memory remained in Elizabeth's quiet murmurs, the ones spoken in the dark when no one was meant to listen. Among the men, another figure stood close, Sir John Harrington, her godson and court wit. Harrington was clever, a man of letters, loyal and amusing. He entertained Elizabeth with stories, offered her poetic translations, and gently teased her in ways others could not dare. She permitted it, perhaps even needed it. His observations of her final years, preserved in his writings, are among the few windows we have into those months, veiled in language, but heavy with implication. "She clings to her silence," he wrote once, "and shuns the light even at breakfast." Then there was the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, a solemn man devoted to his faith and his Queen. In the last weeks he sat beside her for hours, praying as she stared into the fire. He spoke scripture. She rarely answered, but she did not send him away. In that flickering quiet, where robes rustled and tears were not yet allowed to fall, these few, Cecil, the Archbishop, her ladies, kept vigil over the last breath of a legend. They saw her change. They saw the firmness in her step vanish, the brilliance in her eye flicker. They saw the queen who had once held court like a sun now shrink into herself, like a dying ember, glowing softly under too many layers of brocade. And through it all, none dared speak of the end. Because to do so would be to unravel not just a woman's life, but the carefully woven fabric of decades. Elizabeth had been more than monarch. She had been myth, mother, mirror. To suggest her fall was to suggest a world unmoored. So they waited, they bowed, they kept the fire lit until the moment she stopped speaking, until her body no longer held the crown's weight. In the next part, we will return to the political and religious world Elizabeth held together, how her decisions shaped the soul of the nation, and how, even in her final silence, the structure she had built trembled at the thought of change. In the long shadow of Elizabeth I's reign, it is easy to forget that beneath the glittering ceremonies, beneath the veils of velvet and gold, the realm she governed was never stable by nature. It was always, in some deep and quiet place, on the edge of fracture. Religion, succession, foreign threat, these were not temporary fires, but embers that never fully cooled. And Elizabeth, through delicate manoeuvring and relentless calculation, had kept those embers from bursting into flame. It was her greatest political triumph. Not victory on the battlefield, but the quiet holding together of a country straining at its seams. The deepest wound in that fabric was religion. She had inherited a realm torn in two. Her father, Henry VIII, had broken from Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England. Her brother Edward had pushed Protestant reform to radical ends. Her sister Mary had then reversed it all with a violent Catholic restoration. Hundreds had died under Mary's heresy laws. The stake had become a common sight. By the time Elizabeth ascended the throne, England was exhausted by extremity. The scars were fresh, families were divided. Faith was not a private matter, it was a battlefield. And Elizabeth, still in her 20s, had to choose Rome or Reformation, Catholicism or Protestantism. She chose a third path. The Elizabethan religious settlement, passed in 1559, was an act of exquisite political compromise, or cunning, depending on one's view. It established the Church of England as the national church, reaffirming the monarch as its supreme governor. It restored the Protestant Book of Common Prayer, but retained certain Catholic elements in ritual and appearance. It permitted outward conformity without probing too deeply into private belief. In essence, it allowed many to believe what they would, as long as they outwardly obeyed. It was peace, but uneasy, a peace held not by trust, but by mutual silence. The Pope excommunicated her in 1570, declaring her a heretic and encouraging her assassination. Catholic plots against her life multiplied, some imagined, some dangerously real. Jesuit priests were hunted, captured, executed. The law was harsh, and yet Elizabeth, ever cautious, did not relish persecution. She disliked martyrs. She wanted obedience, not blood. She once said, "There is only one Jesus Christ. The rest is a dispute over trifles." It was not a theological position. It was a political shield. Her greatest religious threat came not from within, but from her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. A Catholic with a strong claim to the English throne, Mary had been a figurehead for rebellion from the moment she arrived in England. Elizabeth imprisoned her, guarded her, moved her like a dangerous artifact. For 19 years, Mary lingered in shadow, a living threat. And then in 1587, Elizabeth signed her death warrant. It was, by all accounts, one of the most agonizing decisions of her reign. She delayed, she hesitated, she wept, and yet she knew. As long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's throne would never be safe. The execution, once carried out, severed a bond of blood. It also sealed Elizabeth's transformation, from cautious ruler to ruthless guardian of her crown. But even after Mary's death, the danger did not pass. In 1588, the Spanish Armada launched from the southern coasts of Europe, blessed by the Pope, funded by Catholic might, and aimed squarely at the heretic Queen. It was not just war. It was a crusade. The defeat of the Armada was miraculous. A convergence of bad Spanish planning, better English strategy, and the weather, which Elizabeth's subjects called the Protestant wind. It marked the turning point. From that moment on, Elizabeth was no longer merely defending her reign, she was shaping a Protestant nation. And yet she never claimed divine right as fervently as other monarchs. She never demanded worship, only loyalty. Her religious views were personal, private, shielded even from her bishops. She attended services, she took communion, but she disliked sermons, disliked religious debates. She once rebuked a clergyman for speaking too freely about the succession, saying, "This is a subject I will not hear of. I mean to live and die in this seat." Her silence was her doctrine, and that doctrine left a mark on England. It gave rise to a national church neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant, something singular, something uncertain. It planted the seeds of what would later bloom into religious identity, not faith as fervour, but as part of being English. But the settlement came at a cost. Catholics lived in fear, many conformed publicly, worshipped secretly, some fled, some died. Puritans, too, chafed at the halfway measures, longing for a more radical reform, and found themselves censored, silenced, or banished from court. Elizabeth played the centre, not out of indecision, but out of necessity. She knew that in a country so fractured, any clear line would become a sword, and so she ruled with ambiguity. She allowed both sides to see what they wanted in her. The Catholics hoped she might convert. The Protestants saw her as their shield. She gave neither a full victory, but she gave both something greater. Time to heal, time to stabilise, time to imagine a future without war in the streets. By the end of her reign, that middle ground had hardened into foundation. The Church of England was no longer a compromise, it was identity. And yet in her last years, Elizabeth began to sense its fragility. She saw the rising Puritan factions. She saw the quiet resurgence of Catholic sympathy. She saw the youth of England leaning away from the moderation she had crafted. The tension was there, in Parliament, in the pulpit, in the eyes of her bishops. And perhaps that is why she never named a successor, because to name one would be to tilt the scale. To remind everyone that, despite her efforts, the settlement was not a final peace, merely a holding of breath. James VI of Scotland was Protestant, yes, but his mother had been Mary. His claim bore the scent of blood and compromise. Elizabeth likely feared that her death would unbind all she had restrained, and she may have been right. But for as long as she lived, the structure held. The crown, the court, the church, they followed her. Because she was not merely monarch, she was the seam that held the fabric of the kingdom together. In the next part, we will leave the institutions behind and explore something more intimate, Elizabeth's body, how it was perceived, protected, adorned and concealed, and how her own physical form became a battleground between power and perception. In a reign built upon perception, Elizabeth's body was never wholly her own. It was a vessel of power, a site of projection, a canvas upon which her court, her people and her enemies painted their expectations, fears and fantasies. From her earliest days as queen, every movement, gesture, illness and inch of visible skin became a matter of national significance. She understood this from the beginning, understood that to rule as a woman in a man's world meant mastering the art of visibility while hiding the truth beneath it. The crown rested not just on her head, but on her face, her figure, her carefully maintained illusion. In portraits, Elizabeth appeared timeless. Her skin unblemished, her posture divine, her waist impossibly narrow, her eyes alert and untroubled. But these were not mirrors. They were messages. Each portrait was a constructed spell, symbols layered upon symbols, designed to communicate strength without arrogance, femininity without weakness, divinity without heresy. There was, for example, the famous Darnley portrait, painted in the 1570s. Elizabeth wears a high ruff, a richly embroidered gown, and a face devoid of expression. Her hand rests on a globe, her fingers stretching toward the Americas. She is not simply queen, she is destiny. The message is clear. Here is a ruler whose body is the axis around which the world turns. But behind the canvas, reality whispered a different tale. Elizabeth's health had never been perfect. As a young woman, she had suffered from frequent headaches, digestive discomfort, and nervous energy that kept her pacing for hours. After her near-fatal bout with smallpox in 1562, her skin was scarred, her hair thinned, and she grew ever more private about her appearance. The scars from that illness were, perhaps, the first betrayal of her body. They forced her into the habit of cosmetic concealment. White lead paste for the skin, vermilion for the lips and cheeks, kohl for the eyes. Over time, this mask became part of her myth. But beneath it, her body bore the costs. The lead in Venetian ceruse was known even then to be harmful, though the full extent was not understood. Its daily application would have seeped into her bloodstream, attacking her kidneys, weakening her nerves and dulling her senses. It caused trembling, fatigue, and eventually the skin it touched would crack and darken, which in turn required more paint. It became a vicious cycle, concealment creating the very flaws it was meant to hide. Her teeth were another source of pain and secrecy. Accounts from foreign ambassadors described them as blackened and her breath as less than pleasant. Tooth decay was common in the era, but Elizabeth suffered particularly. Meals were selected with care. She avoided hard foods. Her smiles became rarer. When she did speak, she often covered her mouth with a hand, a fan, or a piece of cloth. And yet, none of this reached the public eye. To the world, she remained ageless. Wigs became essential. Her natural hair, once red gold and abundant, thinned and dulled with time. Her collection of wigs, elaborate, curled, coloured, adorned with pearls, grew into the hundreds. Each one fitted, powdered, adjusted to perfection. Few saw her without them. Even fewer lived to describe it. Her hands, once praised for their elegance, became gnarled with age and swelling. She wore gloves, white, embroidered, scented, even indoors. Her feet, pressed into ornate slippers, ached with bunions and deformities from decades of rigid shoes and standing through endless ceremonies. But the physical pain was not the hardest burden. It was the relentless exposure. A male monarch could age, grow corpulent, lose teeth, gain wrinkles. His wisdom was assumed to grow with his years. But a female monarch, especially one who had refused to marry, bore no such luxury. To show weakness, to show age, was to undermine her legitimacy. Elizabeth could not grow old. She could not sag or stoop or stumble. And so she did everything in her power to preserve the image. Her chamber was a place of ritual. Dressing was an elaborate affair, requiring time, skill, and silence. Only her most trusted ladies were permitted to assist, and even they were expected never to speak of what they saw. They wrapped her in corsets so tight they left bruises. They painted her face each morning with care. They replaced the gloves that no longer fit, adjusted her jewellery to draw the eye away from tremors. There were no mirrors, not after a certain point. Whether by her order or removed by those who feared the Queen's reaction, the reflections disappeared. She no longer wished to see herself unmasked. The illusion was to be maintained not only for others, but for herself. Her audience chambers were lit in flattering ways. Her appearances timed to the hour when the light would fall softly. She began to avoid harsh sun, which could crack her make, and bitter cold, which could tighten her joints. Even in processions, she moved with calculated grace. Slow, deliberate, always dignified. But in private, her body rebelled. In her final years, sleep became elusive. Her bones ached, her appetite dwindled. Her limbs swelled, possibly from heart or kidney failure. There were days when she did not rise. Her physicians, cautious and fearful of her wrath, offered gentle suggestions. More rest, less movement, milder food. She ignored most of them. Because to admit the decline was to admit that the body, which had borne the crown so long, could no longer hold it. And yet, even as she suffered, she controlled the narrative. No portraits were commissioned after a certain point. The last official image, the rainbow portrait, shows her not as she was, but as she wished to be remembered. Ageless, commanding, divine. A queen whose body was no longer human, but symbolic. In that image, her gown is covered in eyes and ears. Her face is radiant. Her hand holds a rainbow, her youth eternal, her power unchallenged. The truth was elsewhere, in the trembling fingers beneath her gloves, in the lines hidden beneath powder, in the woman who, in her final weeks, sat for days on her cushions, unable to stand, unwilling to lie down, as though to recline would be to surrender to the inevitable. Her body, once the site of so many projections, of purity, power, perfection, had finally exhausted itself. And still, she kept up the performance. In the next part, we will explore the mysterious final illness of the Queen. The silence surrounding it, the whispers of those who observed her, and the absence of any clear diagnosis, as we move closer to the final unravelling of the monarch, the myth, and the woman. In the dim corridors of Richmond Palace, early in the year 1603, something began to change. At first, it was not a single event, but a quiet unravelling. Elizabeth I, Queen of England and Ireland, began to withdraw more deeply into herself. She had always been private, always guarded. But now there was something new beneath the stillness, a heavy, silent refusal. She would not eat, she would not sleep, she would not speak. Those around her, the few trusted women who had served her faithfully for decades, watched with helpless anxiety. They had seen the Queen in illness before, during the smallpox fever, the long days of grief after Dudley's death, the moments of melancholy that sometimes passed like clouds across her face. But this was different. There was no cause, no wound to treat. It was as if the Queen's spirit had begun to depart before the body gave it leave. And yet, no proclamation was made. No physician rushed to her side. In those final weeks, Elizabeth would not allow them near. The silence was not born from fear of pain. She had endured far worse, but from something deeper. A refusal to let others name what she already knew. To speak of illness would be to invite it. To allow examination would be to admit weakness. And Elizabeth Tudor had spent a lifetime building herself as the monarch above frailty, above ordinary human endings. She had begun, as she often did in times of emotional turmoil, to walk the rooms in solitude. Even when her legs ached, even when her hands trembled. She paced the gallery, slow steps muffled by heavy carpets, her thoughts unknowable. When her ladies asked if she would rest, she shook her head. At times she would sink to her cushions and remain seated for hours, motionless but alert, wrapped in shawls and furs, gazing into the fire as though watching something beyond the flames. By early March, her condition had worsened. She no longer ate even the simplest meals. She accepted only sips of broth, if anything. Her already thin frame began to wither. Her speech became rare, fragmented. Sometimes she mumbled to herself, her words impossible to decipher. Names from the past were heard. Robin, cat, mother, whispered into the silence. She refused to go to bed. That was the most troubling sign. Her chambers were prepared for sleep, warmed and darkened, but Elizabeth would not be led there. She insisted on remaining in her day room, seated, swaddled in layers. Her ladies tried to reason, pleaded with tears in their eyes, but Elizabeth would not lie down. Must, she whispered once when urged to rest, is not a word to use to princes. And so she sat, day after day, night after night. Some believed she feared that lying down would mean death. Others whispered that she was already speaking with those beyond, that she saw ghosts of the past waiting in the shadows. The women closest to her noted that she grew afraid of mirrors, of light, of being touched. They bathed her hands with warm cloths, combed her hair with care, and offered prayers under their breath. The Queen who had ruled with fire now drifted like smoke through her palace. Physicians were eventually brought in, though not by her command. She did not allow them to examine her fully. They observed, speculated. Some thought it was a deep melancholy, a wasting of the spirit. Others whispered of dropsy, the swelling of the limbs with fluid, a sign of heart failure. Some suspected pneumonia, or a lingering infection worsened by her refusal to eat or rest. But no fever burned her cheeks, no cough shook her chest. There was only stillness, only the slow inward turning of a woman who had ruled for 44 years and seemed to be folding herself inward, cell by cell, into silence. By March 20th, Elizabeth could barely keep her eyes open. She had not spoken a full sentence in days. Her hands trembled, her lips cracked. Her voice, once so commanding, so crisp, was now a faint breath, barely more than the rustling of her gown. Her council, in growing alarm, gathered around her chambers. Robert Cecil was called. The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned. Outside, spring stirred faintly, the thawing of the Thames, the call of distant birds. But inside, time held its breath. On the 22nd, she ceased responding to her name. Her eyelids flickered, but did not lift. She sat still, propped on pillows, as the candlelight flickered against the walls. Her attendants kept vigil, silently weeping, unwilling to break the hush that seemed to settle not just in the room, but in the very walls. The next day she was laid on her bed, at last. Whether she permitted it or was too weak to resist, no one could say. Her thin hands were folded across her chest. Her breath was shallow, irregular. A minister read psalms beside her. A few courtiers knelt. Still, no official diagnosis was spoken. It was not the custom to pronounce a queen's death in medical terms. There would be no autopsy, no open record. And perhaps that, too, was her final design, to leave her end as unknowable as her life had been. Just before dawn on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth stopped breathing. She died without fanfare. No cry, no convulsion, just the long pause between breaths that never resumed. Her ladies closed her eyes. Her physician recorded the moment. The Archbishop murmured the Lord's Prayer, and the world outside remained unaware, for a few hours more, that the last Tudor had passed into history. No one could say with certainty what killed her. Perhaps it was the slow accumulation of age, grief, and loneliness. Perhaps her organs had failed from years of lead and fatigue. Perhaps her heart had simply grown too heavy with memory. Perhaps she had willed herself to vanish. But in that dim chamber at Richmond, wrapped in silence and sorrow, the question mattered less than the moment itself. The Queen was dead, and no one could yet grasp what that would mean for the living. In the next part, we will trace the quiet and anxious transition from Elizabeth to James. The uncertainty of succession, the hidden preparations of Robert Cecil, and the careful steps taken to ensure that the kingdom did not fall into panic as the Virgin Queen's long shadow finally lifted. The silence that followed Elizabeth's final breath was not merely the hush of mourning, it was the hush of uncertainty, a moment suspended between reigns where no crown yet sat upon a living head, and every heartbeat within Richmond's walls seemed to echo too loudly. She had left no child, no will, no public declaration of a successor. Her death had not been announced, and yet the realm could not wait. In that space between dusk and dawn, as her body cooled beneath its embroidered coverlets, the true machinery of monarchy began to turn. Robert Cecil, who had served her with quiet efficiency and unblinking loyalty, stepped forward. He had long prepared for this moment, silently, cautiously, behind closed doors and encoded letters. For years he had cultivated a secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland, Elizabeth's cousin, and the son of her executed rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. Though the Queen had never formally named him, though she had refused again and again to speak the words aloud, Cecil had read her silences as permission. And more importantly, he had made certain that when the time came, no other name would stand a chance. In the hours after Elizabeth's death, he gathered with a few of the Privy Council, men who had worn their loyalty to the Queen as a second skin, but who now turned their minds to the future. The door to her chamber was closed, her leapt bewept behind it. But outside, in the corridors of Whitehall and beyond, word had already begun to seep through. There could be no power vacuum, no delay, no panic. And so Cecil acted. A letter, already written and sealed in anticipation, was dispatched to Scotland. Couriers rode through the damp March dawn, their orders clear and urgent. Inform King James that the Queen is dead and that he is now King of England. The message reached Holyrood with astonishing speed. James had waited his entire life for this moment. His claim, though strong, had once seemed distant. He had learned patience, had tempered his ambition in the icy courts of the Scottish nobility. But now he was to inherit not merely a kingdom, but the legacy of one of the greatest monarchs in English history. In London, Cecil and the council issued the formal proclamation. It was read aloud at the gates of Whitehall, in the city squares outside St. Paul's Cathedral. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. Elizabeth's death was confirmed, and James Stuart was proclaimed James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in one person. The crowd, though subdued by grief and uncertainty, received the news with cautious relief. There was no uprising, no factional bloodshed. The transition, though underpinned by careful manoeuvring, appeared seamless. Behind the scenes, however, anxiety pulsed. James was a foreign king. He had never walked the halls of Westminster. He had never sat among the English lords. Would he honour Elizabeth's legacy? Would he respect her policies? Would he purge her court? Would he bring with him a flood of Scottish favourites, eager to claim English wealth and titles? The ambassadors of Spain and France watched closely. The Catholic factions murmured. The Puritans hoped for reform. The old guard feared displacement. And through it all, the figure of Elizabeth loomed, not just as a memory, but as a standard by which all would now be measured. Cecil, careful and unflinching, worked day and night to manage the narrative. He arranged for the Queen's body to be moved from Richmond to Whitehall, where it would lie in state before the funeral. He ensured that proclamations emphasised continuity, that no whispers of unrest found traction. that every noble, bishop, and magistrate declared loyalty to the new king with polished urgency. But he also, quietly, preserved the dignity of Elizabeth's departure. He ordered the royal wardrobe to prepare mourning garments. He consulted with the archbishop on the funeral liturgy. He ensured that her ladies-in-waiting were not dismissed, not immediately, but kept in service until the burial, to ease the transition and to respect the memory of the Queen who had ruled over them since before many were born. Meanwhile, James began his slow journey south. His progress from Edinburgh to London was ceremonial, deliberate, and surrounded by watchful eyes. He stopped at noble houses, accepted homage, held court in miniature. England's nobility flocked to him, eager to secure favour, to pledge loyalty, to ensure survival. The king smiled, took notes, said little. He knew he was stepping into a house not his own. The house Elizabeth had built was not merely of stone or law. It was of memory, of loyalty, of fear and reverence. To many she was still our queen. And though she lay in silence, her presence was not yet gone. At court her rooms remained untouched, her bedchamber was sealed, her personal effects catalogued, her jewellery returned to the crown inventory. But some items, a ring, a book, a set of keys, were held aside, quietly, perhaps out of sentiment, perhaps out of fear that to remove them too soon would break something sacred. The new king would arrive in late spring, but until her body was laid to rest, England remained, in spirit, Elizabeth's. And still, the question lingered, one no proclamation could answer, and no counsellor dared to voice. What would become of the world she had so meticulously held together once the weight of her absence began to settle? In the next part, we will walk the path of Elizabeth's funeral, the grandeur, the symbolism, the unspoken grief, and how England, in burying its queen, struggled to understand what exactly had been lost. On the morning of April 28, 1603, the bells of London tolled low and steady. The air was thick with grey mist, as though the city itself had taken on the colour of mourning. It had been over a month since the Queen's death at Richmond, and now finally Elizabeth Tudor, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, England's monarch of 44 years, would be laid to rest. But this was no simple burial. This was a farewell to an era. The streets were lined with black. Every building of note, every church, every guildhall, every gate, was draped in mourning cloth. Windows were shuttered. Shopkeepers bowed their heads. The Queen's subjects had known for weeks that she was gone, and yet for many, the sight of her funeral procession made the loss tangible for the first time. At the heart of the pageant was her coffin, a lead-lined sarcophagus covered in rich velvet, set upon a massive carriage drawn by 4 horses caparisoned in black. Upon the coffin rested an effigy of the Queen, fashioned in wax and wood, dressed in royal robes, crowned in gold. Her face was composed, serene, untouched by age. Even in death, the image of Elizabeth remained one of eternal majesty. The coffin had been carried from Whitehall through the streets of London and toward Westminster Abbey. The route was lined with soldiers, clergy, court officials and commoners alike. As the procession passed, thousands fell to silence. No cries of grief, no raucous mourning, just quiet, heavy, reverent, unbreakable. Behind the coffin rode a great company of nobles and officials, dressed in black, wearing mourning hoods and gloves, members of the Privy Council, judges, bishops, knights of the realm. Some rode solemnly, others walked. All moved with slow, deliberate steps. Among them was Robert Cecil, expression drawn, eyes cast downward. He had orchestrated much in his life, and this final act of pageantry, was no less important. He had ensured it would reflect the scale of her reign, the gravity of her passing. No one would mistake this for a passing moment. This was the close of an age. Women of the court followed on foot. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, many of whom had served her for decades, walked with veils drawn, hands clasped. Some wept silently. Others bore the pain without outward display, their sorrow wrapped in protocol. It was said that as the Queen's effigy passed, one of her former attendants fainted. She had never known another ruler. The music was sparse and haunting, muffled drums, deep tolling bells, slow hymns. The notes floated through the mist and echoed off the stone walls of London, a sound both ancient and unfamiliar. For no one alive had witnessed the burial of a queen regnant before. Elizabeth had outlived all who could remember her coronation. Inside Westminster Abbey, the great nave had been transformed. Candles flickered in tall sconces. Black velvet draped every visible surface. A canopy had been constructed above the place where the coffin would rest, trimmed with gold and embroidered with her coat of arms. The choir had been rehearsing for days. The seating was arranged with military precision, nobility in their ranks, clergy in theirs, foreign envoys in elevated galleries above. As the coffin entered, carried now by 12 pallbearers, the air seemed to shudder. The effigy atop the coffin swayed slightly with each step, its painted eyes gazing endlessly into the nave, unblinking. The scent of incense mingled with the dampness of the day, and the entire space, though filled with people, felt somehow hollow, as though England itself was holding its breath. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward. John Whitgift, frail and pale, his voice cracked with age, spoke the liturgy in Latin and English. He had served her faithfully. He had prayed beside her bed, and now he sent her soul on its final journey. There were no long eulogies. Elizabeth had not wanted them. She had made no request for elaborate praise, no final declarations. But the Archbishop's voice trembled as he said, "She was the most princely and gracious and learned woman that ever ruled in this land, a queen that feared God and hated none but disloyalty." 1,000 candles flickered. The coffin was lowered into the vault. She was placed not in a grand solo tomb, but beside her sister Mary, the very woman who had once imprisoned her, who had been her rival in faith and throne. Their shared resting place bore a simple inscription, "Consorts both in throne and grave, here lie two royal sisters, Elizabeth and Mary." It was a gesture of unity, or perhaps of poetic irony. For Elizabeth, who had defined herself in opposition to Mary's reign, who had distanced herself from the cruelty and fervour of her sister's legacy, now lay eternally beside her. As the final prayers were whispered and the congregation stood in heavy silence, it was said that a gust of wind passed through the abbey, scattering the flame of a single candle. A servant moved to relight it, but paused. "Let it burn out," he was told. "Let the light go with her." Outside, the procession reversed itself. The carriages departed. The mourners dispersed. But no one spoke above a whisper. It would take time to remember how to speak of Elizabeth in the past tense. In the days that followed, her likeness began to appear everywhere. Artists painted new versions of the effigy that had ridden atop her coffin. Pamphlets described the funeral in reverent tones. Ballads were sung in the streets, quiet, melancholy verses about the Virgin Queen who had kept England whole. Children were named after her. Streets would bear her name. In corners of the realm, candles were still lit at night, not in hope, but in honour. And even as James rode toward London, the realm he would inherit was not yet his in spirit. For Elizabeth's funeral had not only marked the end of her life, it had marked the burial of an age. An entire generation had grown old beneath her rule. To many, she was England. And now England would have to remember how to be something else. In the next part, we will turn away from the mourning veil and into the shadow of legacy. How the early years of James's reign were shaped by the presence of the Queen he followed, and how her memory became both blessing and burden for those who dared to succeed her. When James VI of Scotland crossed the border and became James I of England, he entered a kingdom that did not yet belong to him in spirit. Though he bore the crown by right of blood and was welcomed by law and proclamation, he stepped into a court still shaped in every corner by the woman who had just been buried in silence and gold. Elizabeth's death had opened the door to a new political age, but her presence lingered, not only in the memories of those who had served her, but in the structures of power, the weight of expectation, and the very air of the court she had ruled for nearly half a century. James was 42 years old when he arrived in England. He had ruled Scotland since he was a child, born amid violence and intrigue, raised by regents, steeped in Calvinist theology, and trained in the brutal pragmatism of northern politics. He was educated, shrewd, and intellectually restless, fluent in rhetoric, fascinated by theology, and convinced of divine right. But where Elizabeth had ruled with mystery and magnetism, James ruled with familiarity and frankness. He spoke too much, too plainly, too often, and the English court was not used to that. The court Elizabeth left behind was a theatre of illusion, a place where silence, symbolism, and spectacle were as important as policy. James, by contrast, preferred the company of men he trusted. He was tactile, chatty, impatient with ceremony. His arrival shattered the careful choreography that had defined the Tudor court. He brought with him a train of Scottish nobles, friends and favourites, men eager for English lands, titles and influence. They were met with cold glances. Many English courtiers who had clung to Elizabeth's favour now found themselves displaced. The language changed, the customs shifted, the pace of the court turned rougher, louder, less reverent. Yet Elizabeth's image remained. Her portrait still hung in the great halls. Her emblem, the Tudor rose entwined with the fleur-de-lis, was carved into the very furniture. Her motto, Semper Idem, always the same, still glinted from the ceiling beams. Even in absence, she watched him. James tried to honour her. He ordered that her tomb in Westminster Abbey be grander than Mary's, her sister. He allowed the continued printing of books praising her rule. He spoke well of her in council. But he could not escape her shadow. In every decision he made, comparisons followed. She had kept England from war. He made peace with Spain. She had ruled alone. He ruled as a husband and father. She had concealed emotion. He displayed it freely. And for those who had adored Elizabeth, the veterans of her court, the clergy shaped by her religious settlement, the poets who had praised her as Estrella returned, James felt like an outsider, a stranger, a disruption. The Puritans saw opportunity. They petitioned him for further reforms, for the stripping away of what they saw as Catholic remnants in the Church of England. They believed James, raised in the strict faith of John Knox, would sympathise. But James, ever wary of losing control, resisted. He told them bluntly at the Hampton Court Conference, no bishop, no king. The message was clear. He would not be ruled by ministers or mobs. He believed in authority, his own. Elizabeth had balanced religion with silence. James sought to control it with reason. Parliament, too, found the change jarring. James expected deference. He viewed the Commons as an advisory body, not a partner in governance. His speeches, long-winded and studded with theology, confused and annoyed them. Elizabeth had known how to charm. James lectured. Even in appearance, he was her opposite. Elizabeth had mastered her image, regal, ethereal, untouched by decay. James was earthy, awkward, ungainly. He walked with a rolling gait, spoke with a thick accent, wore clothing without elegance. He laughed too loudly, spoke too freely, touched too much, and yet his rule began without rebellion. That was no small feat. There were no pretenders, no uprisings, no civil unrest. His succession, so long anticipated and so carefully prepared by Robert Cecil, unfolded with remarkable smoothness. He entered London to cheers. The city welcomed him. Bells rang. Bonfires were lit. The people, exhausted by anxiety over the succession, exhaled at last. But peace is not always comfort. Many of Elizabeth's subjects felt displaced. Her court had been a familiar stage, filled with rituals they understood, ruled by a queen who rarely revealed herself, yet made them believe they knew her. James, in contrast, was all exposure and no mystery. And still, Elizabeth's name was invoked. In poems, in sermons, in private letters, the comparisons continued. Every misstep of James's early reign, real or imagined, was measured against her memory. When he granted favours to Scottish lords, Elizabeth's caution was praised. When he lavished attention on his favourites, especially the handsome young Robert Carr, whispers of scandal echoed louder because of her example. She had kept her private life veiled. James did not. Even in death, she disciplined her successor. The poets remembered her with sharpened sorrow. Michael Drayton wrote of her as England's daughter and its sovereign dame. John Donne alluded to her in his sermons, linking her to the divine order. The image of the chaste and brilliant queen lived on, sharpened by nostalgia. And for James, ruling in her wake was like walking across a frozen lake, every step echoing louder than intended. He did not try to erase her, but he could not help but be measured by her. And beneath it all, something deeper was taking root. A shift not only in rule, but in imagination. The Elizabethan world of myth and mask, of subtle diplomacy and veiled declarations, was fading. In its place came something rougher, more personal, more uncertain. The early modern world was arriving. James ruled over it, but Elizabeth haunted it. In the next part, we will step away from the halls of power and into the minds of the people, to see how Elizabeth was remembered not by nobles or poets, but by the common folk, the villagers and merchants, the sailors and seamstresses, whose lives had been shaped by the reign of a queen they never touched, but somehow still believed they knew. Far beyond the vaulted ceilings of Westminster and the echoing galleries of court, Elizabeth's name lingered in the hearts of her people, not as a sovereign in a gilded portrait, but as something more intimate, more woven into the rhythm of their lives. For the villagers, merchants, soldiers, sailors, and widows of England, she had become a presence felt rather than seen. Her reign, though distant from their thatched rooftops and muddy lanes, had shaped the seasons of their lives with a quiet, steady hand. They had known no other queen. To them, Elizabeth was not merely a ruler. She was the sun under which crops had grown, ships had sailed, children had been born, and old men had died. She was the steady name in their prayers and proclamations, the face on their coins, the voice behind the justice of the local assize, the reason the bells rang for victory or for peace. Even if they had never seen her in person, and most had not, they spoke of her as though they had. God save the Queen, they had murmured for decades, and now she was gone. In the months following her death across the English countryside, word of her passing reached even the most remote hamlets with a dull and leaden weight. There had been no sudden catastrophe, no war or famine to mark the end, just a strange emptiness. In taverns and village greens, people gathered to hear the proclamations read aloud by local officials. The Queen was dead. Long live the King. But the words did not land easily. To many, Elizabeth was not just the monarch. She was our Queen. She had been there in the years of poor harvests and good. She had brought safety from the Spanish threat. Her name had carried weight in every church, every schoolhouse, every sermon, and she had been a woman. That fact mattered more to the common folk than many chroniclers allowed. In a time when women had so little say over their own lives, to see a woman atop the world, commanding armies, silencing bishops, outliving traitors, was not only inspiring, but unsettling, in a way that gradually bred awe. They did not understand all her policies. They had no insight into her counsels, but they knew she had stood firm, that she had endured. Stories about her circulated far beyond the cities. Some said she had never aged, that her skin was like alabaster even in her final years, that her hair shone gold until the end. Others said she had spoken to angels, that she had cursed Spain with a word, that she had once disguised herself as a commoner and walked the streets of London unnoticed, weeping for her people in a time of plague. These were not truths, but they were not lies either. They were how people understood her, through the myth that blurred into memory. Fishermen along the coasts remembered how she had given them pride, allowing English ships to challenge the Spanish at sea. In northern towns, where the border wars with Scotland had once brought bloodshed and fire, they whispered about how she had kept peace for so long. In Norfolk and Suffolk, where the Armada had loomed like a shadow across the Channel, old men recalled watching the horizon with muskets in hand, waiting for invasion, and how, when none came, they had thanked her in their hearts. In country churches, her name was spoken with reverence. Priests who had once feared papal retribution now invoked her legacy when explaining the English church to their flocks. Schoolchildren traced her name in wax tablets. Her reign had given structure to their calendars, shape to their liturgies, and purpose to their prayers. And among women, especially older women, Elizabeth was discussed with a strange mixture of admiration and fear. She had not married, she had no children, she had ruled alone. To some that was a marvel, a blessing, a sign of divine favour. To others it was troubling, an unnatural bending of woman's place. Yet none could deny what she had achieved. And for many wives and mothers, her reign had carried a subtle empowerment, not in politics, not in law, but in spirit. If our queen can govern without a husband, they said quietly over spinning wheels and in herb gardens, then we too may speak a little louder. Her image, the one painted onto pub signs, embroidered into tapestries and printed on coins, lingered in everyday life. Even after her death, people still referred to things by her name. The Queen's Oak, the Queen's Meadow, the Queen's Bridge, and her memory became fused with the land, as though she had soaked into the roots of the kingdom she once walked. But it was not just her power they remembered, it was her sorrow. The tales of Elizabeth's loneliness reached the countryside as well. The story of her pacing the halls before death, her refusal to lie down, her silence. These images captured the imagination of the people who knew all too well what it was to suffer quietly, to lose family, to cling to dignity, to keep going when the fire inside had long dimmed, for a queen to die not in triumph but in stillness that made her more human and perhaps more beloved. Ballads were sung in her name, some mournful, others defiant. Wandering singers and minstrels wove tales of Elizabeth's childhood, her escape from the Tower, her defiance of Spain. In alehouses and marketplaces, fragments of songs could be heard. She wore no ring, she bore no child, but ruled with hand and words so wild. The wind she spoke, the tide she turned, and in her flame a country burned. No king, however grand, could immediately erase her presence. Even James, as he made his progress through the countryside, was met by people still wearing mourning bands. Some offered gifts in Elizabeth's name, not his. Some asked questions he could not answer. Would the church remain the same? Would there be war again? Would their queen be remembered? He smiled. He moved on. But the questions remained. Because for the people of England, Elizabeth was more than monarch. She was an era, a certainty, a mother, a legend. And though they now bowed to a new king, many still whispered her name when they lit candles at night, as though somewhere beyond the clouds and stars the Virgin Queen still watched over them. Not with judgment, but with the quiet, exhausted understanding of a woman who had given all she had to keep them safe. In the next part, we will explore how Elizabeth's legacy lived on in the generations that followed, in literature, in theatre, in legend, and how the memory of her became a mirror in which England would see not only its past, but its hopes, its fears, and its evolving identity. As the years slipped forward and Elizabeth became memory rather than news, her figure did not fade into dust and silence. Quite the opposite. In time she grew larger, more luminous, more sharply defined in the imagination of her people than she had ever been in life. Her legacy was not preserved in stone or sceptre alone. It breathed in words. It lived in the rhythm of poetry, in the curve of a playwright's line, in the songs sung long after her bones were sealed beneath Westminster's stone. In the decades that followed her death, England changed. The court of James I ushered in a new sensibility, less mystery, more discourse, less icon, more policy. He encouraged scholars, penned treatises, presided over theological debates. The Elizabethan court, with its pageants and riddles and whispered symbolism, receded into the realm of memory. And in that space, in the shadows left by her departure, writers began to shape her anew. One of the most subtle and significant forces in that reshaping was William Shakespeare. Though the bard never explicitly wrote a play about Elizabeth, her spirit drifts through his works like candle smoke. She had been his patron, his queen, and in ways unspoken, his muse. During her reign, he had written A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and Henry V, works that reflected the order, the mythic strength, and the theatrical splendour of the Elizabethan world. But after her death, his tone shifted. He wrote Macbeth, a meditation on kingship, guilt, and the fear of legitimacy. He wrote King Lear, a tragedy of a monarch undone by age and isolation. In these late works, the grandeur of queenship gave way to the frailty of sovereignty, and though they were performed in James's court, Elizabeth's ghost wandered through them. The powerful, enigmatic queen was gone, and in her place stood rulers who questioned their purpose, who faced betrayal, who unravelled. Even his Tempest, with its final act of farewell and relinquishment, felt like an echo of Elizabeth's last days, a surrender of magic, a breaking of the staff, a fading of authority into something quieter and unresolved. Other poets spoke more directly. Edmund Spenser, who had died before Elizabeth, had already begun the work of mythologizing her in The Fairy Queen, where she appeared as Gloriana, radiant, just, eternal. His epic poem had painted her not merely as monarch, but as an allegory of virtue. That image took root, and after her death it flowered into cultural memory. Michael Drayton, Ben Jonson, and John Donne would all touch upon her legacy. Jonson wrote of her reign as a golden time, unmatched by what came after. Donne, once a Catholic outsider, referred to her as a queen who brought peace without pride, firmness without fury. But it was not only the poets who carried her name forward. Theatre companies continued to perform the dramas of her era, and audiences, though seated under new monarchs, still responded most deeply to the echoes of the Elizabethan voice. Ballads passed from mouth to mouth, songs of her defeat of the Spanish, of her courage at Tilbury, of her refusal to marry. In rural festivals, children dressed as queens in white, carrying sceptres made of willow. In village plays, her story was acted out, part truth, part invention, all reverence. The tale of her walking among the troops in silver armour became legend. The story of her outwitting foreign suitors with clever turns of phrase was told again and again, growing sharper, funnier, more theatrical with every telling. And in time, she ceased to be Elizabeth the woman. She became Elizabeth the idea. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the last Tudor, the Protestant defender, the mirror of princes. It did not matter that much of it was half true or wholly invented. Myths do not ask to be accurate, they ask to be believed. And the myth of Elizabeth offered England something it craved, a mirror in which to see its greatness, its endurance, its complexity. In an age of war, she was peace. In an age of doubt, she was conviction. In an age of decay, she was beauty unyielding. In portraits painted after her death, Elizabeth looked younger than she had in life. Artists removed wrinkles, straightened her posture, brightened her gaze. In each new depiction, she became more celestial, more statuesque. The scars were gone. The fatigue vanished, the mortal body dissolved into symbolism. Her words were remembered not as strategy, but as wisdom. Her loneliness was recast as sacrifice. Her refusal to marry was sanctified into purity. And yet, those who had known her, who had served her, who had stood in her presence, they remembered other things too. They remembered the sharpness of her tongue, the impatience, the sudden laughter that could vanish into silence like a falling curtain. They remembered her perfume, a mixture of rose and musk, the soft click of her jewelled shoes on the marble, the scent of lead paint in the heat, the way she never forgot an insult or a kindness. And in the spaces between memory and invention, the legend grew. Generation after generation, her name remained. During the Civil War, when Charles first lost his head, Elizabeth was remembered as the monarch who had kept the peace. During the Restoration, when ceremony returned, her pageantry was invoked. Even in the Age of Empire, when Britain reached far beyond the island, she was called upon as the first great naval queen, the mother of English sea power. No other monarch was remembered with such fire, because no other had ruled alone so long, so completely, and with such careful illusion. And in remembering her, England remembered itself, not as it was, but as it longed to be, wise, bold, indivisible. In the next part, we will turn from the afterlife of her reputation to the quieter traces left behind, the physical legacies of her reign, hidden in architecture, language, law, and the rhythms of the realm she shaped with such careful, enduring hands. Even after the echo of her voice faded from the great halls of Westminster, Elizabeth's handprint remained pressed into the very shape of the kingdom she had ruled. It lived in stone and parchment, in city plans and language, in the quiet continuity of systems that moved beneath the surface of English life like tides, often unseen but ever present. This was her subtler legacy, not sung in ballads or painted in golden oils, but inscribed into the walls, rituals, and rhythms of the land. She had been a monarch of consolidation, not conquest. Her power lay not in building new empires, but in shaping the soul of a country teetering between division and unity. And to do so, she left behind more than legend. She left scaffolding. In London, her influence was carved into the very skyline. The city, scarred by fire, plague, and time, still bears traces of her reign. Buildings like the Royal Exchange, founded by Thomas Gresham, but granted royal endorsement by Elizabeth in 1571, reflected her vision for England as a centre of commerce and strength. She had visited it in person, walking its galleries, blessing its merchants. The exchange became not just a hub of trade, but a symbol of sovereign partnership with the rising power of the market. Beneath her rule, the merchant class flourished. Guilds expanded. Trade routes opened. The East India Company, granted its charter by Elizabeth in 1600, would grow to become one of the most influential commercial forces in the world. Though she could not have foreseen the full consequences of this grant, her decision to back trade, exploration, and chartered companies was pivotal. It set the wheels in motion for a global Britain. In Oxford and Cambridge, her touch is present still in the foundations of learning. She granted new statutes to colleges, encouraged the education of men who would serve her in court and pulpit. Her reign marked a flowering of intellectual life, not as an explosion, but as a slow, deliberate cultivation. The curriculum sharpened, the press expanded, the rhythm of English prose evolved. The English language itself, once thought unruly compared to Latin or French, matured during her reign. Writers and preachers found their voice. Translators rendered ancient texts into English with elegance and gravity. And in church, under her direction, scripture and prayer became the domain of the people, no longer locked behind foreign tongues. It was during her reign that the Book of Common Prayer was reissued, revised, and fixed in public life. Its cadences, its dignified restraint, its balance of beauty and clarity, all became foundational to English worship, but also to English speech. Her court may have spoken in riddles, but her church spoke with measured grace. And then there were the laws. Elizabeth did not flood Parliament with new legislation, but she shaped its use with care. Her reign saw the evolution of legal procedure, the strengthening of centralized courts, and the slow, deliberate entrenchment of the common law. While she was no innovator in judicial theory, her steady hand allowed a fragile legal system to solidify. It was under Elizabeth that England began to think of itself not as a collection of regions, but as a singular realm, with one language, one law, one church, one queen. Her policies were often conservative, sometimes reactive, but always pointed toward cohesion. She avoided the extremes. She softened the edges. She removed, with surgical precision, those who threatened the fragile balance. Architecture bore her taste too. Though she was not a builder in the grand fashion of some monarchs, her court ushered in the Elizabethan style, a blend of Gothic and Renaissance, sturdy and ornate, pragmatic yet poetic. Long galleries, tall windows, intricate plaster ceilings, and brick facades with diamond-paned windows. These became the language of the great English houses. Hardwicke Hall, famously described as more glass than wall, reflects this era's confidence. Its tall windows, unprecedented in scale, were both a sign of wealth and a declaration of openness, a literal expression of light and vision. Though not built by the Queen, it was built in her image, the image of a modern, poised England looking outward. Her reign, too, left its mark on the map. The Virginian settlements, fledgling and fragile though they were, bore her name. Virginia, a land christened in honour of the Queen, who had never married. These early colonial footprints were small, often doomed to failure, but symbolically vast. They marked the beginning of England's slow, conflicted expansion across oceans. And yet, her truest architectural work may have been in time, not space. Elizabeth's calendar, the liturgical and political year she shaped, ordered English life long after her death. Her progresses, those grand royal tours through the countryside, became not merely ceremonies but annual expectations. The court's movement created seasons. The Queen's presence defined regions. Her absence was marked like a shadow. Even her image, reproduced on coins, playing cards, wall hangings, set a precedent for how monarchs were seen. No longer faceless, no longer distant. She became the standard, the icon, the face by which time was measured. For many, a coin bearing her profile was the only portrait they would ever possess. They carried her in their purses. They touched her with their hands. And in the structure of England's identity, she built something invisible but lasting. She left behind no dynasty, but she left an ideal, that a single figure with intellect, resilience, and careful control could hold together a nation divided by faith, threatened by enemies, and haunted by its own violence. She ruled not by fear alone, nor love alone, but by presence, by being everywhere, in word, in symbol, in law, in light. And so, in every parish where the Book of Common Prayer was read, in every school where children learned English letters, in every court where justice was spoken in her name, Elizabeth lived on not just as history, but as habit. In the next part, we will explore the more fragile side of her legacy, the uncertainties she left behind, the costs of her decisions, and how, beneath the golden sheen of her age, the seeds of future tensions and fractures had already begun to grow. Beneath the golden embroidery of Elizabeth's legacy, beneath the polished myth and the careful architecture of unity, there were fractures, thin hairline cracks that would in time widen. For all her brilliance and mastery, for all her poise and political restraint, Elizabeth first left behind a kingdom not entirely whole, not entirely settled. The elegance of her reign had masked a slow accumulation of unresolved tensions, concealed under the weight of performance and the shadow of her personality. She had been, in many ways, a human dam against floodwaters. And with her gone, those waters would begin to seep, first quietly, then forcefully, through the foundations she had so meticulously preserved. Chief among the cracks was the question of succession, that looming, ever-present uncertainty that had hung over her reign like a silent omen. For nearly 5 decades, Elizabeth had refused to name an heir. She had been pressed by Parliament, urged by foreign diplomats, even pleaded with by friends, but she remained elusive. Naming a successor would have invited court factions to realign, rival loyalties to take shape, conspiracies to form. It would have made her reign feel impermanent, and Elizabeth could not abide impermanence. She was the centre. She was the future. She was semper idem, always the same. But in shielding herself, she left the nation unprepared for what would follow. James's succession, though managed by Robert Cecil with breathtaking caution, did not come with the kind of stability that a formally endorsed heir might have enjoyed. His foreignness, his unfamiliar court, and his swift redistribution of favour all alienated factions of Elizabeth's former establishment. The careful dance she had maintained between moderate Catholics, Protestants and Puritans began to unravel. The religious settlement, so artfully maintained under Elizabeth's reign, was not, in truth, a permanent peace. It had been a truce born of her own personality, her refusal to pry too deeply into the soul, her distaste for fanaticism, her careful calibration of appearances. But she had solved the problem of faith by deferring it, by cloaking it, by mastering ambiguity. James had no such subtlety. He attempted to unify where she had carefully divided, to clarify what she had deliberately left blurred. He held theological conferences, issued new instructions to the clergy, and eventually authorized the King James Bible. A majestic literary triumph, yes, but also a theological assertion. The pressure points Elizabeth had covered with velvet began to throb. Meanwhile, the Puritans grew louder. The Catholics, hopeful at first, soon became disillusioned, and in 1605, only 2 years after Elizabeth's funeral, came the Gunpowder Plot, an explosion that, had it succeeded, would have obliterated Parliament and the King. Its roots stretched deep into the frustrations that Elizabeth's silences had masked, and James's declarations had exposed. Even abroad, her careful balancing act left a precarious inheritance. She had ended her reign in war with Spain, a war that drained England's coffers and strained its spirit, though it never became a full invasion. Her foreign policy had been one of hesitance and hedging, of indirect involvement and financial backing to Protestant causes abroad. She had supported the Dutch against the Spanish, the Huguenots against the Catholics, but never with full commitment. It was diplomacy through ambiguity. That caution had protected England, but it also meant that at her death, the country held no firm alliances, no clear direction in continental politics. James's peace with Spain, though prudent, was seen by many as betrayal. Elizabeth's ghost hung behind every diplomatic manoeuvre, her cautious restraint making James's pragmatism appear like weakness. At home, there were other tensions. The financial situation she left behind was brittle. Elizabeth had famously ruled with thrift. Her court, though splendid in appearance, had been run with tight control. She sold royal lands to fund her needs, kept taxes low to avoid unrest, and relied heavily on monopolies. Exclusive rights to produce or trade certain goods, granted to favoured courtiers. These monopolies became a festering wound. By the end of her reign, they were resented by the commons and gentry alike. They inflated prices, stifled trade, and bred corruption. Though Parliament had begged her to reform them, she deflected, promising investigation but changing little. Her control over Parliament, honed by decades of experience, kept the issue at bay. But when James inherited the system, lacking her finesse, the resentment boiled over. And then there was Ireland. Elizabeth's long campaign to assert English authority over Ireland had ended in violence and bitterness. The 9 Years' War, which stretched through the final decade of her reign, devastated the island. It ended only with the Treaty of Mellifont in 1603, the same year she died. But the peace was uneasy. The cost, in blood and treasure, was enormous. The plantation policies that followed would haunt Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. Even within her court, the illusion of unity masked quiet decay. She had ruled through a circle of remarkable men, Walsingham, Cecil, Dudley, but by the end of her reign, most had died. Their sons and successors were capable, but lacked the deep loyalty to Elizabeth herself. The Queen, increasingly isolated, surrounded herself with younger courtiers, men like the Earl of Essex, whose rebellion had shattered what remained of her emotional fortitude. She left behind no trusted inner circle, only shadows of loyalty and ambitions waiting for a new throne. And always the question of gender lingered. Elizabeth had defied the expectation that a woman could not rule. She had weaponized her virginity, mystified her body, turned femininity into spectacle and statecraft. But she left behind no model, no clear path for future queens, only a singular example, impossible to replicate, dangerous to challenge. In many ways, Elizabeth had ruled like a bridge, spanning the chasm between medieval monarchy and early modern statehood. She had preserved the illusion of divine right while practicing the art of negotiation. She had worn the robes of monarchy while operating as a calculating politician. She had spoken like an oracle while thinking like a strategist. But the bridge, though beautiful, was narrow, and behind it, the chasm still yawned. In the next part, we will shift our gaze from legacy to enigma, and return to the intimate, unanswered mystery that still hangs over Elizabeth's final days. Not only what may have killed her, but what she feared most about dying, and why she may have resisted it until silence was the only answer left. In the final twilight of Elizabeth's life, long before breath ceased and the vigil began, there was something else that slipped quietly into the chamber. A presence, invisible yet immense. Fear. Not panic, not alarm, not the sudden terror of pain or accident. This fear was slower, deeper, the kind that grows over years and then sharpens at the edge of sleep. It was not the fear of death alone. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, had seen death too many times to flinch. She had stood beside the scaffold. She had signed the warrants. She had escaped its shadow in her youth. She knew death intimately. But knowing a thing does not make it easier to face. The fear that hovered over her, that seemed to coil into the corners of her bedchamber, was more complicated. A web of memory, legacy, belief, and something very human. The fear of being unmasked. For a woman who had spent a lifetime mastering illusion, the end posed an unspeakable threat. Death was final, yes, but it was also revealing. In death she would be still. In death she could not adjust the light, or command silence, or smile just so. In death the mask might slip. That mask had been her greatest creation. Not just the painted face, the white lead, the rouge, the carefully arched brows, but the entire persona. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the divine monarch whose body was a symbol, whose soul belonged to England, whose pain was never seen, whose desires were spoken only in metaphor. That mask had protected her. It had given her power. It had made her not a woman, but an institution. And yet behind it, there was someone else. There had always been. There was Elizabeth the girl who had watched her mother be executed. Elizabeth the prisoner, afraid of her sister's wrath. Elizabeth the scholar, who loved languages and solitude. Elizabeth the lover, perhaps, or almost lover, who had longed and feared and mourned. Elizabeth, the aging woman who stared at the fire for hours, who would not eat, who would not lie down, not because she feared pain, but because she feared surrender. Her last weeks were filled not with outbursts, nor with confession, but with silence. And what does it mean, truly, when a woman like Elizabeth I, so articulate, so commanding, chooses silence at the end? Was it grief? Was it calculation? Was it resistance? Or was it fear of the final thing she could not control? Not the dying itself, but the undoing? To lie down was to submit. To sleep was to be vulnerable. To be still was to be seen. And so she stood. She sat. She paced. She whispered. She refused. Those around her, her ladies, her physicians, her clergy, could not coax her. They pleaded. They offered scripture. They suggested rest. She dismissed them all with gestures or brief phrases. She seemed to move between this world and some other space entirely. Some said she spoke to shadows. Some said she addressed her mother. Some heard her murmur the name Robert Dudley, though he had been dead for 15 years. Others claimed she spoke to Essex, or to no one. And then, at last, she stopped speaking altogether. It was as if the fortress she had built so carefully over years of diplomacy, loss and performance had begun to crumble from within. And rather than let anyone witness the collapse, she chose to close the gates. What did she fear? Perhaps judgment. Not from God, but from time. Elizabeth had lived with the awareness that every decision would be recorded, interpreted, rewritten. She had shaped her story with the care of a playwright. Her speeches were composed, revised, rehearsed. Her portraits were adjusted. Her court was choreographed. Even her refusals of marriage, of war, of heirs were made into narrative arcs. To die was to lose the pen. To die was to become someone else's story. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't ready to give it up. It is possible, too, that her fear was physical, that she sensed the creeping failures of her body, the stiffness in her limbs, the weakness in her chest, the nausea, the tremors, that she knew something was wrong, but refused to let anyone name it. To speak the illness aloud would be to acknowledge it had power. And Elizabeth, to her final hour, could not abide anything having power over her. In those last hours, she permitted the Archbishop to pray beside her, but she gave no confession, no last testament, no whispered regrets. She left behind no personal letters to be read after her death, no parting message to the nation, no word for her successor, no explanation of her silences. Only a gesture, a nod perhaps, when asked if James should succeed. And even that, some said, was more myth than moment. It is haunting, this refusal, this quiet resistance. It leaves us wondering what thoughts churned behind her closed eyes, what truths she took with her, what memories passed like shadows across her mind in those final days. Did she see her mother's face, sharp and beautiful, before the fall? Did she recall the cold stone of the tower, or the thrill of her coronation day? Did she see Dudley's hand reaching for hers? Did she hear the roaring crowds of Tilbury, the hymns of the Armada's defeat, the silence after Essex's execution? Or did she finally see herself, not the queen, not the myth, but the woman? Perhaps that was her greatest fear. Not death, not decay, but recognition, to be seen for who she was. And so she wrapped herself in silence. And when death came, it came quietly, as she had demanded, as she had chosen. In the next part, we will examine how modern scholars and physicians have tried to diagnose her final illness, piecing together historical fragments, testimony and records, to explore whether a single medical explanation could ever contain the truth of her death, or whether, as with all legends, the mystery is part of the legacy. In the centuries since Elizabeth's death, scholars, historians and physicians have pored over the fragments left behind, piecing together the puzzle of her final days with a mixture of reverence and forensic fascination. It is a curious impulse, this desire to name what went unnamed, to diagnose what was deliberately left shrouded. There was no official cause of death recorded, no autopsy performed, no contemporary physician's account that survives in full detail. And so, what remains are impressions, remarks from her ladies, whispers among courtiers, scattered lines from letters and diaries, written by men, women who watched her fade, but could not or would not speak plainly about what was unfolding. And yet, from this patchwork, modern minds have attempted to identify the thing that ultimately took her life. Among the most frequently discussed possibilities is blood poisoning, lead toxicity to be precise. Elizabeth, like many noblewomen of her time, used a cosmetic known as Venetian ceruse. This heavy white paste, made from vinegar and white lead, was applied to the face to achieve the pale, porcelain-like complexion so valued in courtly beauty. It masked blemishes, it hid the pockmarks left by her smallpox illness, it preserved the illusion. But it also killed slowly. Lead poisoning, especially with long-term exposure, causes a cascade of symptoms: fatigue, headaches, memory loss, tremors, abdominal pain, irritability, insomnia, and depression. It affects the kidneys, the nervous system, and eventually the mind. The symptoms recorded in her last years, the refusal to eat, the tremors, the insomnia, the episodes of melancholy, the faltering memory, all could point to a gradual lead-induced breakdown. Her skin had become sallow under the powder, her hair thinned beneath her wigs, her teeth blackened and loosened, possibly a result of both poor dental hygiene and toxicity. And yet, she continued to paint her face each day with thicker and thicker layers. The very act of maintaining the image may have hastened the decline. Another possibility is cancer. Some historians have speculated that Elizabeth may have suffered from oral or throat cancer, conditions not uncommon in an age of untreated infections and long-term exposure to irritants like tobacco, which had just entered English society, and the toxic cosmetics she applied near her mouth. Contemporary reports noted a refusal to eat, an aversion to conversation, and, most tellingly, her tendency to cover her mouth when speaking late in life. There were no records of severe coughing or bleeding, but a tumour in the throat or jaw could have explained her silence, her pain, her withdrawal. But there is no certainty, only suggestion. Others have pointed to pneumonia. It was March when she died. The Thames still ran cold. Her palaces were draughty, and she famously refused fires in her later years, even when her ladies pleaded with her to accept the warmth. She would not lie down, even as her body weakened, and eventually sat still for days, wrapped in cloaks, unmoving. Her refusal to rest, combined with long periods of immobility, could have led to fluid in the lungs, a respiratory infection that grew quietly until her breath simply faded. But pneumonia often brings fever, laboured breathing, coughing, none of which are recorded in her case. Then there is the idea of depression, or what the early physicians called melancholia. The death of the Countess of Nottingham in early 1603 and the confession tied to the ring from Essex is said to have broken something in Elizabeth. She had already been withdrawing in her final years. The loss of Dudley, Walsingham, Cecil, all the men who had anchored her reign, had left her surrounded by younger courtiers who admired her but did not know her. Her loneliness was more than political. It was personal. It was crushing. Her grief was described not as weeping but as stillness. She sat for hours without speaking. She refused to eat, to sleep, to dress. This is more than sadness. It is the body submitting to sorrow. Modern physicians might diagnose it as major depressive disorder. In an age before antidepressants, before talk therapy, before a language for mental illness that treated the condition rather than condemned it, Elizabeth had only silence. She had shaped her life through control, and in those final weeks the only control she could exert was to stop participating in life. And then there is another explanation, quieter, older, harder to define. Willed death. The phenomenon is rare but not unknown, particularly among the elderly, particularly among those who have lost their core sense of identity. It is the deliberate, quiet act of turning away from life, of refusing food, refusing rest, refusing care, not out of despair, but out of resolve. Elizabeth had ruled through control, and perhaps when all else fell away, her last act of power was to choose the moment when she would let go. It may have been none of these things, or it may have been all of them. A slow accumulation of lead, of grief, of loss, of exhaustion. Her body had endured war, cold, hunger, the plague, betrayal, and illness. She had outlived everyone who had ever held her as a child. She had watched a world reshape itself under her hand. Perhaps when her work was done, her body simply followed. But the mystery remains, unresolved, unsolved, and strangely intact. And maybe that's how she would have wanted it. After all, her reign was not built on clarity. It was built on shadow and shine, on masks and meaning, on performance and presence. To know her fully would be to dissolve the enchantment, and she guarded that spell until her final breath. Her death, then, becomes an extension of her reign, uncertain, unknowable, and haunting. In the final part, we will return to where we began, to the question of legacy, not as it was remembered by others, but as it may have looked through Elizabeth's own eyes. What did she believe she was leaving behind? What did she hope the world would remember, and what perhaps did she fear they would not? It is a strange thing to rule for nearly half a century, to hold a nation in the palm of your hand, to shape its laws and language, to be its voice and its mirror, and then to face, in the quiet of your final days, the truth that no legacy is ever truly in your control. In those last hours at Richmond, Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, sat not only at the end of her life, but at the end of a story she had written in flesh, in gold, in silence. She had lived without a consort. She had died without a child. She had named no successor aloud. Her reign had been her world, and beyond it, she had left little but questions. And perhaps that was by design. For a woman who had spent her lifetime being watched, measured, admired, and doubted, Elizabeth knew that power did not lie in clarity. It lay in suggestion, It was not what she said, but what she left unsaid, that lingered. It was not her smile, but the pause before it. Not her words, but the echo they left behind. Her legacy, as she might have seen it, was never meant to be neat. It was not a lineage. It was not a monument. It was something more elusive, presence. Presence in the minds of her people, presence in the rhythms of the land, presence in the long corridors of power where men would still speak her name when no one else could hold the room. She had lived through treason and fire, through plague and war, through a lifetime of doubts about her right to rule. And in doing so, she had become something more than queen. She had become the idea of England itself, fierce, wounded, brilliant, alone. In her final moments, we can only imagine what crossed her mind. Did she remember her childhood? The flash of steel as Anne Boleyn fell, the chill of the tower, the sound of footsteps outside her cell. Did she remember the hush of the crowd on her coronation day, the scent of rain on the Thames, the weight of the crown pressing down upon her youth? Did she remember the heat of Dudley's hand, the betrayals she forgave, the ones she could not? Did she hear the bells of Tilbury or the silence after Essex was gone? Or did she think simply of the crown, that object she had worn so long that it had become not a symbol, but a second skin? There are no answers, only a room, a silence, and the slow closing of eyes that had once seen everything. But perhaps the clearest glimpse we have into her own vision of legacy is the speech she gave to Parliament in 1601, the Golden Speech, as it would later be called. She was old by then, and weary. She stood before them not in triumph, but in reflection. She said, "Though God hath raised me high, yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves." That line holds more than affection. It holds the truth of her reign. Elizabeth knew that the power of a monarch did not rest only in law or lineage. It rested in perception, in loyalty freely given, in the hearts of those who watched her rise and hoped she would not fall. She gave them not certainty, but continuity. Not airs, but order. Not softness, but strength. And in doing so, she left behind something more enduring than blood. She left a country that had, for the first time, begun to think of itself as a single breathing thing. A nation shaped by a woman's voice, a woman's will, a woman's silence. She had ruled alone, she had died alone, and yet she had never been truly alone. Her people, for all their doubts and fears, had followed her, and when she was gone, they kept her, in story, in song, in the quiet ways that a country remembers its ghosts. Her tomb stands in Westminster Abbey, beside the sister who once held her prisoner. Above her grave, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest two royal sisters, Elizabeth and Mary." But history has not remembered them equally, for it is Elizabeth, the last of the Tudors, the solitary flame, whose reign would come to define not only a century, but a vision of a monarch who needed no husband, who endured betrayal without bitterness, who turned silence into authority and death into myth. A vision of a queen who, even now, hundreds of years after the candles were snuffed in her bedchamber, still walks the halls of memory, tall, unbending, glittering beneath a crown only she could truly wear. And though time has taken her body, her voice remains, in the language, the law, the legend, a whisper still carried by the wind through old stone corridors and over English fields. Elizabeth, the Queen, not perfect, not eternal, but unforgettable.